Hi, Vanessa.
Hi, Dom. How's it going?
How is Mexico?
It is a dream here in the warm lands of Mexico. The only thing that's not a dream is all the
Dead journalists?
Gadunk.
And on that morbid note, welcome to Uncertain Things.
Welcome to Uncertain Things.
We have a slightly different kind of show for you today.
Yeah, off the regular path for us.
It's been a while since we had one of our how things work kind of talk. I've been wanting to start getting to some conversations about perception and the mind. It applies to a lot of our work in regards to attention, to obviously social media, the press, our societal malaise, our partisanship, our inability to communicate, all the themes that we love discussing here on Uncertain Things. But we wanted to take a higher resolution view of what is it about our brains that make us so susceptible to these problems. So down the line, we're going to have evolutionary biologists, psychologists, et cetera, et cetera. But today, we have potentially my favorite take on this subject from Daniel Roy, who has indeed studied neurobiology, but is, in his day job, a sleight of hand artist. And in his performances and on his YouTube channel, he very happily discusses the aspects of our thinking that makes us prone to illusions and even crave them, and how these can be hijacked and manipulated by a talented performer or, a nefarious actor. And P.S., if you haven't already, listen to our conversations with Batya Ungar-Sargon and Martin Guri, because we talk about this a lot.
And we should note that Adam knew of Daniel Roy because, unbeknownst to me, Adam is a magic nerd. I did not know this.
I am a magic nerd.
This is something I learned about him in this process.
That is one of my...
your guilty pleasures, apparently.
I'm a very proud magic nerd. I like gummy bears and magic tricks. So we talk about neurobiology. We talk about what makes us crave the deception that magic offers, and what makes some people be less entertained by the art. We obviously take it to some of the applications that I mentioned before. Daniel is very pedantic in his scientific, rigorous approach, which means he balks at any attempt of such a careless journalist like myself to tie in together too many threads. We obviously talked about the art of magic itself, the community of magic. How has a community that is fundamentally based on secrecy been affected by the advent of social media and YouTube and overexposure? What kind of ethical problems do magicians face vis-a-vis their audience and each other? Overall, it was a riveting conversation, and I'm not just saying it because I was totally hammered throughout. So just two small apologies. We recorded it together in one room, which was nice, but due to technical constraints, Vanessa and I kept passing the same mic between each other, so you might hear that every once in a while. But more tragically, Daniel also performed a phenomenal magic trick in person, which we also took a video of, hoping to share it with you. Unfortunately, the video file got corrupted because I'm a Luddite, so me and technology don't get along. So I'm still keeping the audio of the magic trick at the tail of the interview. I cut it out so not to interfere with the flow of the conversation. But if you're curious, it's in the post-credits. So, I mean, you might hear us referencing the trick during the conversation, but just consider it a Christopher Nolan audio experience. Filling in the blanks of the story out of synchronicity is really what makes this podcast so fun. So with that, please follow us on uncertain.substack.com We post there regularly, and and we will also share links to Daniel's YouTube page, of course, so you can actually see his wondrous magic for yourself. So if you enjoy what we're doing here at Uncertain Things, please give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, because that helps us a lot to reach more people. And with that,
Daniel Roy.
Hey, Daniel.
Hello.
This is the first time we have what's a magician, a card swindler, or
Yeah, pick your term. Yeah, sleight of hand artist, magician. Yeah, I'll take it.
neurobiologist by trade, by
Sure.
training.
Yeah. At least undergrad.
Undergrad. So start by telling us a little bit about yourself.
So I got into magic when I was 10. I'm currently a professional sleight of hand magician. Kind of an emphasis on the cheating at cards for fun, and the neuroscience angles as well. But when I was 10, the preschool that I had gone to when I was really little, they were holding a fundraiser, right? And it was in this kind of big concrete warehouse in San Francisco where I grew up. And the theory here was, have a lot of cute kids, little 10-year-old alumni at the fundraiser. Parents will donate more money, that was the theory. And I think it worked. But anyway, big kind of concrete space. And I got stationed at the station that had a mechanical bull. I don't know if you've heard of those things, right? Like it's like a rodeo, but it's a robot. Anyway.
Was it like a full-size mechanical bull for 10-year-olds?
Oh, yeah, with like mats and stuff around it. Crazy, right? But obviously a 10-year-old can have no meaningful involvement in this contraption for legal reasons. So I was pretty bored, and I wasn't really getting many takers. But the guy who ran the station, turns out he was a magician, and to keep my attention occupied, he did a few magic tricks for me. And I'd seen magic done before, right, on stage. But however much I love stage magic, I'd always kind of had the nagging feeling in the back of my head, maybe this is just a case where I'm so far away that I can't see how it's done. Or if I was closer and if I could inspect the props, maybe I'd know the secret. But this was magic that was done right here in front of my eyes. And so it was a very kind of visceral experience of wonder. And since then, I've just been obsessed with not really experiencing that for myself, but creating that feeling in others. I don't quite know why that was the initial compulsion of make this thing rather than feel this thing more, but it just was. So I went to the local magic shop that week, and I was 10, but I impressed on the owner that I really wanted to learn serious sleight of hand. I didn't just want like a trick deck of cards or whatever. And he sold me a book called Card College, Volume 1. It's the first volume of a 5-volume set by the Swiss magician named Roberto Giobbi.
Before you go into detail, I just want to give context that part of the reason that you're here is because I was a huge magic geek as a child. And for me, my first step was to buy the regular magic trick card that they deck that they sell, with the generic party tricks that everybody can do. And I was really excited, and then I wanted to go up the next level, and they said, okay, good, read these books. It was like, all those books with really weird sketches of how to hold your hand. And like, no, I'm going to play piano. And that was the end of my magic career.
Yeah, that was exactly it. And there's a pretty big lag time when you're at least that age, because these books are it's written for adults. So it's very, very technical. It's like, hold the cards in left-hand dealing position, which means the outer phalanx of the index finger lies just in line with the top card of the deck, and the second, third, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right?
But you future neurobiologist was like, yes, this is up my alley.
Yeah, that, and I was like, Dad, I don't understand this. What does this sentence mean? And that was a lot of that. But I was just obsessed, so I ended up over the next few years going through the whole series and a bunch of other books and videos as well. And I practiced incredibly seriously from age 10 to 14. I mean, sometimes 8, 10, 12 hours in a day, especially on the weekends. So I was, wildly obsessed. And then I kind of burnt out, especially going into high school. Right? Kids that age don't see you as a multidimensional person. They just label you. So I was like the magic kid, right? And I didn't want to be that going into high school. So I quit for a few years. And it was only near the end of high school that I got back into it. At my high school, some of the teachers were putting on these like one-off lectures on some topic they knew something about. And I was like, I should do one about magic history. I can at least talk about that even if I don't really do any of it anymore. So they said, okay, sure. So I put together a little lecture on that. But in order to do that, I ended up having to relearn a lot of magic. And as a result, I just got really back into it with a passion. And so that was a moment where I kind of looked back on everything I'd learned so far. And okay, what am I missing? And the technique that I'd always wanted to learn but never had is called the bottom deal, which is you pretend to take the top card. Actually, you take the bottom one. it's something that comes from.
Yeah, no, I just give more context to people who don't care at all about magic or card dealing, and what does that mean?
Yeah, so basically, if we think about magic, right, there are lots of branches of magic. But within specifically close-up sleight of hand magic, that means it's operating through manual dexterity, misdirection psychology, and I'm generally performing with smaller props, and this is something that you are watching, a few feet away from me, rather than on a big stage or whatever.
In other words, this is an area where you have a lot of attention being put into catching the magician cheating, like when they're cheating in cards. So the art is to make sure that no matter how closely you're being watched, the other person still can't see what's really going on.
Yeah, and so there's sort of a bifurcation of the different sleight of hand techniques you have to learn. There are techniques that are purely for magic. They're just for magic tricks. And then there's a whole group of techniques that come from the card table, right, that are used by actual card cheats. And they say in management that 10% of the people take 90% of your time to manage. The same thing is true here. 10% of the sleight of hand techniques take 90% of your time to learn because of the gap in difficulty. So the bottom deal is one of those secret sleight of hand card cheating techniques where, I'm going to deal a game of poker and I secretly got the aces on the bottom and I deal out some hands of cards and I deal the aces to myself and then you win. It's a little more complicated than that, but you get the idea. So I just became obsessed with this. I tracked down some mentors, people who knew a lot about how to do this move and put a few thousand hours into this one technique specifically. And then came a bunch of other card cheating techniques along with it. And then I went to UPenn for college in Philadelphia and really enjoyed University of Pennsylvania. But I also got in touch with a magician in Washington, D.C. named Darwin Ortiz, who's become a dear friend and mentor to me over the last 6 years now. And he's really a world expert in these gambling sleight of hand techniques. And so I would go to D.C. every so often, take, 4 or 5 hour lessons. And that was another route through which I learned a lot about this stuff. And partway through college, I started out studying molecular biology and then sort of transitioned into neurobiology as I got towards the upper level classes. I started to realize there's a lot of crossover here, right? Because I can do all the fancy sleight of hand in the world, like you were talking about earlier. And ultimately, you know that I'm going to lie to you, right? I'm a performer. You're like, okay, I'm sitting here. I'm in a theater. This guy's doing stuff with cards. He's supposed to lie to me. I'm supposed to be entertained, maybe. And so I have to get you to lie to yourself, right? Because anything I say is suspect, but anything you say to yourself is, presumably more believable. I think a Teller of Penn and Teller is a great quote where he says something along the lines of that the most deceptive lie or the most convincing lie is the one that you tell yourself. And this is a similar idea to that, right? I have to get you to fundamentally I have to get you to tell yourself that something is the way that it isn't, or vice versa. Which means ultimately all magic happens in your brain. I mean, in a more literal sense of, okay, well, it's just, photons hitting my hands and the cards and going into your eyes, and there's a lot of fancy processing, and you make sense or try to make sense of what you're seeing. So in that kind of very literal sense, obviously it's happening in your brain, but also in a more metaphorical sense, right? I mean, this is fundamentally me trying to trick your brain into tricking itself. Which means you can understand all of it through neurobiology and neuroscience, someday in the future as our understanding of the brain improves. So I started to take a lot of neuroscience classes, found that very interesting. And now, since graduating in 2020, obviously the world's been a bit of a weird place for the last year and a half, 2 years. Gosh, I don't know if you heard, there's this thing going around. It's been a little weird. So a lot of things were virtual, did a lot of virtual performing, started making YouTube videos and got wildly lucky with one of them, and then have kind of ridden the wave since then. And that's sort of been the trajectory. So now in my performances, I think, I put a big emphasis on the, sleight of hand used to cheat at cards. I find that fascinating. I also like to talk a little bit about the neuroscience angle so people can understand some of that without giving too much away, of course. Right. And that's sort of the cocktail that I present these days.
So you were talking about the connections that you were seeing between the magic that you were doing and the neuroscience or neurobiology that you were studying. What are some of the common ways that magic takes advantage of the ways that the typical human brain sees or understands magic?
Yeah, so
before you answer, I will get myself more wine.
I think the first thing to emphasize is that, right, we have a number of different levels at which we talk about the brain, right? Because, again, our understanding of the mind is so brain mind. I'm going to use those interchangeably. I'm not meaning to invoke any kind of dualism here, but just to be precise.
Right, the Descartians of the house are already rebelling.
Of course. Yeah, I may be a little careless in my lingo there. Yes. So we have to be careful about at what level we're talking about, right? Are we talking about the brain in terms of, all right, well, this group of neurons is interacting with this group of neurons? Are we talking about something within a single neuron, like how an action potential works? Or are we talking about a much higher level, like psychology concepts? Or are we talking about like a sort of metaphorical, philosophical, even broader, higher level, right? We have to be careful that we don't start an explanation at one of those levels and unknowingly jump to a different one, right? Because just because we can identify some concept that operates, more broadly, like something I'll talk about in a moment is inattentional blindness, right? That does not tell us anything necessarily about the underlying neural circuitry, right? Just because I say, this is a psychological phenomenon that we can observe in people and test experimentally, that does not tell us, well, it's one group of neurons doing this, or it's this specific circuit, or it's localized to this area of the brain. There's a whole separate set of experiments, right, that are a whole different field than even what I studied that you have to do to answer those questions, right? So I think that's an important distinction. And the focus of a lot of what I did undergraduate was, I started out in the molecular biology and I went into neurobiology. So a lot of what I studied was, at the level of the neuron. And our level of understanding of the brain is not quite at the point where we can be like, here's how a card trick tricks you. Here's how neurons work. And we understand everything in between those. We don't. But it's really interesting to try to bridge as much of the gap and to look at researchers who are doing a great job of that. So I think there's a lot of ground to be covered.
But we don't fully understand ideas like spotlight, for instance, right?
Yes. So for example, that's a great word. When we talk about attention, you can think about it as a spotlight. So we generally live with the persistent illusion that we perceive everything around us, and that's not at all true, right? Our attention is actually a very narrow spotlight, and magicians are able to manipulate that. There's a kind of a pickpocket magician named Apollo Robbins, who some listeners may have heard of. If you haven't, go look up his TED Talk on YouTube. It's great. And he talks a lot about this sort of spotlight model of attention as he understands it as a pickpocket. As a magician, what I'm doing is slightly different, but it's analogous. So a great example is something called inattentional blindness, where when we think about misdirection, we think generally about, look over here while I do something else over here, right? Like we're literally getting you to turn your head so that you are looking at spot A, so that spot B is deep in your periphery or even like behind your head. You just cannot perceive it because it's out of your field of view, right? And vision is the sense you're relying on here. It's not like, there's certain techniques that you have to be quiet about, like people could hear them, but it's not like you're worried about the smell of a technique. That's not a thing that's going to get you caught during a show. So, okay, that's one thing. We can just get you to look at one place versus another place by changing what you think is important. But the idea behind inattentional blindness is where it is in your field of view, but you still don't perceive it. And a great way of understanding this in less technical lingo that's more in the magic world is to use terminology that my mentor, Darwin Ortiz, came up with, which is he talks about looking inward versus looking outward. So if I say, Vanessa, are you right or left-handed?
Right.
Right. In order to answer that question, you have to turn your attention inward and think, am I right or left-handed? Right? And that is a moment in which I could potentially have done something in your field of view. And you.
It's also like you put me on the spot a little bit. It's not like we're having a conversation and in the course conversation, well, I'm right-handed too.
Yes.
Because like that feels like a natural reaction. It's like, hello, stop. What is the answer? It's like,
Yep. There's a bit of a kind of social shock value.
Right. That moment that where your brain gets a little hot because you feel like you're...
Even though it's a very easy answer.
Exactly. And this is exacerbated when you're in a more of a theater performance, right? And you're up under hot stage lights.
Right.
And for anyone who hasn't been under stage lights, you can't see anything in the audience. It's like you're on the highway, but there are car headlights pointing into your face. And that's how the audience can see you, but you can't. You're just blinded by them. So when someone else comes up on stage, right, suddenly they're under the hot stage lights. You try to make them feel as comfortable as possible so they have a good time, obviously. But it's still a very different environment. So it often requires a lot of their attention, and we have a limited amount that we can devote to anything at one given time. And so inattentional blindness, sometimes called inattention blindness, is just a great example of getting you to look inward by posing a question or asking you to do something or say, would you hold out your hand or would you do this or whatever, to get you to move your attention inward so that I can more or less do something, not anything, but something semi-sneaky in your field of view, and you're just not going to perceive it or remember it.
How much, from the performance perspective, how much time did it take you to develop the balls to actually do the sneaky thing, while you know that technically the person's eyes are on you, but just you have to train yourself to know that, and that in this split second, I know that they're not seeing with their eyes.
Yeah, it's a great kind of sort of topic to approach, because there are a lot of elements to this. It's a deep question, and right, the first thing, and it applies to a lot of different things. So the first thing you have to ask is, well, right, what might make this go wrong, or like, what am I worried about when I'm performing? It's the same thing. People are like, oh, well, I have so much stage fright when I speak in front of people. Well, the first question is specifically, what are you nervous about, right? And in this case, you're worried that someone's going to see a card through your fingers, or they're going to see your hand move in a way it's not supposed to, or whatever. So the first thing you do is you practice in front of a mirror, and you practice on a video camera, and then you practice in front of your friends, family, forgiving strangers, right? And you need to make sure that from every conceivable angle that matters, the sleight of hand itself is really bulletproof, that someone can stare at your hands and they just can't see what you're doing. That's one thing. But there are moves in magic that you fundamentally cannot completely cover. They require some amount of misdirection to make them work. So those are cases where, right, it's either a case where I have some misdirection where I'm going to get you to look elsewhere, or get you to turn your attention inward, or a whole host of other things you can do. And that's sort of the icing on the cake. But the cake here is, even if you were staring at my hands, you wouldn't see anything, right? So a big part of it is just you practice in front of a mirror until you can do it again and again and again and again. And then, of course, being able to do that same thing, but in front of an audience when you're being paid in front of hot lights, that's a different story, because the pressure's on, right? So being able to do a move well in front of a mirror is very different from being able to do it on stage. What you were initially getting at is, how do you eventually have the confidence to do this, right? And there are two things. One is, can you do it bulletproof in front of a mirror or video where you just can't see it? And then two, are you confident enough in your ability to change people's frame of reference? This is something we can talk a little bit about later, that I think it's much better to understand misdirection as a context rather than a specific technique. But if you can build that context correctly, you can be very confident that someone's attention is going to follow the pathway you want it to follow.
That's one of my big questions. That idea of for reference and context, and specifically the boundaries of this context. Because when I listen to you, and I recommend all listeners do that, describe magic on your channel. One of the things that really struck me is how much of the tricks, at least the ones that you discuss openly, is about drawing a very specific line about where the trick happens, knowing that this is where I need the audience's attention to be, but then also to create the illusion that they experience boundless possibilities, that they can do whatever they want, while actually you're putting their decision on rails.
Yes, I think that's a great way of putting it. Another great way of thinking about it is, it's like one of those kind of like hedge mazes, right? Where you're kind of leading someone through, and you're being like, oh, isn't that part interesting? And isn't that part interesting? And look, that's so cool, isn't it? Right? But what they don't know is those are the only parts of the maze that they can poke at. Everything else the illusion would fall apart. So a great
And before you go into it, it's something that that occupies me in many ways. Part of it is deception, obviously. In the political realm, this is George Carlin has this famous monologue about the illusion of choice, and it's a big part of political philosophy and theory, that idea of creating the illusion of choice while actually having it very narrowly circumscribed. But also, game design. When you design a video game, you want the player to experience freedom as if they can go where they want. But actually the game has limited capacity and limited time to design it, and you're actually putting them on a path usually. It's not even as fun, and this is also crucial for magic. It's not as fun to really have the open-ended experience that you think you want. You want the illusion of choice.
Yes. Yeah, speaking of the word illusion, one of my favorite definitions of the magical experience is that you are creating the illusion of impossibility. This was a term, it's a great way of putting it. It's a term coined by the late Simon Aronson, who I was lucky to befriend before he passed away a few years ago. He, I think, coined this in a 1990 essay. I think it's the Aronson approach, but great book on lots of magic. But specifically, he talks about the illusion of impossibility, and it's like I've never heard magic better encapsulated in 3 words, right? Because barring an instance where someone actually believes that you truly have supernatural powers, and I don't mean in a metaphorical sense, I mean they really believe that you have supernatural powers, and of course there are people who try to convince you that that's the case. I'm not one of those people. And this is really the case in a performance, right? You've paid some money to come watch a guy do magic, right? In your heart of hearts, you know that what I'm doing isn't actually supernatural. And at least the way I present magic, I know what I'm doing isn't really supernatural. And I don't put on any pretense that you're supposed to, believe for a second that this is really, some actual form of magic. However, I have to get you to feel like it's impossible for a moment, even though your sort of intellect, metaphorically speaking, knows that it's not impossible. So it's a conflict between the intellect and the emotions, right? This can't, there has to be a naturalistic explanation for this, but you feel like it just can't be done. So the illusion of impossibility is a really great, I think, way of describing it. And that really is at the heart of the magical experience that you create.
Before you move on, I do want to drag you back to the question about putting the audience on rails.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Importantly, that is really kind of the key to creating that illusion, right? You're creating the illusion that they have much more territory they could explore than what they actually can explore. So there are choices that the audience makes in a trick that really do change the outcome, right? They absolutely do. But there are also lots of choices that you either restrict the choice or you influence their choice, or you are able to find creative ways of just, they think they're making a choice, but they're not. And you can pare down what seems like an infinite number of options into something much more manageable for you to handle with some sleight of hand or whatever. So it's often kind of a bidirectional approach of like, well, I can find any of these 10 cards, right? But I definitely can't find any of these 52 cards. And so I have to make you think that you can choose any card, but like limit your choice in some way. So it's kind of a, constraining certain variables, but if you constrain one variable too much, it's obvious what you're doing, right? So if you can find different points to apply minor constraints, you can still give people lots of apparent choices that are choices. They're just minor choices that converge on the outcome you're aiming for.
So you've talked a little bit about like the ways that you can use basically like mechanics or motor skills to pull people a certain way. You've talked a little bit about the kind of the psychology of like exploiting ways that the brain works and the way we can't pay attention to everything at once and how we look inward versus outward. Are there also ways that you can exploit the social context of a room and use those dynamics potentially to also kind of pull attention one way or the other?
Absolutely, yeah. So there are kind of a few points to cover here. One is people often, when they think about magic, they're like, oh, well, the magician has to make sure that people aren't standing, behind, because that way I'd be able to see what was happening. It's actually the opposite. If you stand behind me, you just end up watching the back of my shoulder for the whole show, and it's pretty boring. A much bigger issue is making sure that people can see that there's even a performance going on. Visibility is key, right? Otherwise, people can't, appreciate what's going on. So that's one consideration. But in terms of, right, so the reason I brought that up in this context is because you were talking about social dynamics, and maybe if I'm performing in, someone's home, right, I may have to do a bit of a furniture rearranging. Not so that people can not see how the tricks work, but just so that they can appreciate the show going on, right? But in terms of social dynamics, yes. So, right, humans have lots of sort of norms of how we behave socially. If you make really large gestures, people will often follow those with their eyes. It doesn't always work, but it can help at least, especially if they think that that's what's already important. That is useful. Also, in terms of general social dynamics, the more you perform, the better you get at sort of the better your sort of snap judgments about how people are what they're gonna be like on stage get, right? You sort of like, I can't tell you how I do it, but like when I come up on stage, and I'm gonna do a close-up performance, which means I need to say call 2 audience members up and they're gonna sit next to me for the next 45 minutes, right? I better pick good people, because it's not that they need to be like easygoing. It's just that they need to be people who I play off of, in an entertaining way, and they're engaged in the show and they're fun to work with, but that they're also not going to give me too hard of a time, right? So you're looking for a very specific kind of person, and often you don't have the chance to talk to people beforehand. If you do have the chance to mingle with your audience beforehand, that's awesome because you can establish rapport with people. It's great. But you have to sort of get good at just looking at a room and just being like, you two, and kind of having some intuitive sense that I really can't explain. I'm using the word intuitive somewhat metaphorically here. I'm not referring to
When you
anything.
say can't explain, professionally can't explain, or just literally can't
Oh,
verbalize?
like literally can't. I don't know if I can verbalize why my kind of brain just went, that person, those are going to be ideal.
So you don't have clear heuristics for this?
I have some. I mean, one thing you can do is you can watch them behave if you peek out from backstage and you watch them how they're interacting, right? You want people who are very emotive on their face because the audience's response to magic is going to mirror the response of the people that are on stage. If this person is stone-faced, the audience will be too to some extent. If this person is very emotive, you generally want to look for that, right? I mean, you want people who look like they are just going to be a lot of fun to work with, generally speaking. But sometimes there are certain situations where I actually want someone who's going to be a bit more challenging, and so or someone who can at least appear more challenging, because there's, of course, a big difference between how people feel on the inside and how they necessarily express themselves in a social situation, especially when you bring them up on stage, right? So you can look for someone who gives off a certain very kind of like imposing vibe, right? And then, sometimes you might want someone who seems a little bit more kind of peaceful or easygoing vibe, just based on whatever routines I'm doing. Sometimes I need an audience member to sort of briefly play a role in a certain story or narrative, and having someone with some kind of general disposition might fit that role better. So it's interesting because there aren't heuristics in terms of like what a person looks like or who they are or their station in life. None of that is a good predictor of any of this. It's just you look at a room and you can kind of get a sense for, all right, that person's going to be fun, and I think this person would be great for that trick, and this person's really emotive when they talk to their friends. They're going to be great for that part, and this guy's like, he looks very skeptical. I think it's going to be funny if I involve him at this moment. Or even there might be a line, like a single line in a show that is coming up, and it's something that you save for a certain point in the show, and you just look at it in an audience and you go, it's that person in the back. That's who I'm going to deliver this line to, because it's based on how I'm seeing them act. It's going to be interesting that way, or funny.
But I still feel that I didn't get an answer for Vanessa's questions. Like, is there a place where you actually use the social dynamic to enhance the magic itself, in the sense of, I guess one thing that I think touched the way that I understood the question was, you said audiences mirror or reflect the expressions of the people on stage. Well, this to me is exactly like the social. You use that partly to manipulate the greater numbers. Is there a way you use the greater numbers also to manipulate the individual that's on stage, for instance?
To some extent. I mean, that's always going on a little bit, because they will, unless they're really comfortable on stage and they're like an actor or something, they're going to feel a little bit more. They're going to feel a little more nervous or kind of uptight. Just generally speaking, and that can be. I mean, you do want people to feel relaxed on stage and be able to, participate, but you also don't want them to be too relaxed where they're kind of like, overly like languid or whatever. That's not helpful. So just the innate pressure of being in front of a room of people, as long as you make them feel comfortable and confident and safe on stage, which is super important, that can be a boon. But in terms of like influencing, like using the social dynamics, let's talk about the unintentional blindness example again. When I ask you a question, you turn your attention inward. Everyone else turns their attention to you. So there's a bit of a whiplash effect where, right, you're going to be looking at my hands. So I can get you to look inward and I can get everyone else to look at you. And suddenly all of the attention is either, within you or at you. And so I get a great little moment of misdirection out of that. So you're actually sort of combining just social norms. When I address you and you start talking, people tend to look at the person who's talking or who's, doing the thing, whatever that thing is in the moment. So you can exploit, for entertainment purposes, obviously, some of those various social norms.
You were talking about the way that sometimes you seek out someone with a very emotive face. I was thinking of my sister. She loves magic. She's like obsessed, and she's probably one of the most emotive people I know. And she's just in when it's magic. She's like, I'm ready for magic to happen. She's like a super fan. But I would imagine that not everyone feels that way about magic.
Yeah, my mom, for example.
Oh, yeah? She's anti-magic?
Oh yeah.
So I'm curious in the emotional spectrum that you've encountered when you're doing magic with people, because I would guess that for my sister there's something wondrous about not understanding what's going on in front of you and that the illusion of the impossible. But for some people, there's probably like anger, right?
Yeah.
Like I'm fucking pissed off. Like that's illogical and I don't like it, right?
Yeah, I love those people on stage because it's really funny.
For my mom, I remember exactly I was just having a talk to her before this conversation. I was just and I told her, "Oh, I'm going to have a magician." And she just groaned. And, like I said, should I train to be as good as Daniel, and then I come home and do a trick to you, first to be resistant. I don't want to see that. I don't care. Then I do it, and then you'll just be annoyed at the fact that you can't figure it out. And she said, "You're right. That's exactly what will happen. And now that we know it doesn't need to happen."
Yeah, when I was in college, of course, studying science, a lot of my friends were like math, science, engineering nerds, right? And those are not people who are like, I want to be caught up in the wonder. They're like, I want to know how this trick works. So I like that, actually, especially if I'm in a group of people and everyone asks me to perform and one person's like, oh, I hate magic. I'm very excited about that. I'm like that just is fun to me at this point to have that, because really what can be most satisfying on stage if you have 2 or 3 people up on stage is if you get contrast between them. Because if you get one person who is like super duper like into the magic, wants to see it all the time, like your sister you were saying, and then the other person on stage is your mom, right? The same thing will happen and you get wildly different reactions out of the people. And it's really interesting because they can sort of play off of each other. I can play off of either reaction. One person is like, wow, that's the greatest thing I've ever seen in my life. And the other person's like, I deeply hate you and resent my life choices. And the fact that you get that, and the audience is watching this play out, right? So it's a bit like an improv play happening on the audience's faces. And I love that. I really enjoy it. Now, when you're earlier on, when you're just starting out and, the tricks are a lot more vulnerable, like people can poke at stuff and it'll fall apart, right? That's really tough. But when you've been doing it for a really long time and you kind of know all the things that people could say or do or, kind of try to pick apart, you're pretty comfortable with people going after any element of it and, being able to handle that. So for me, I just love the challenge at this point. I enjoy it.
Are there examples of people that have gotten under your skin?
It's rare that I'm like actually truly, it's very rare that I ever encounter someone who I would call, give the term a heckler on stage, right?
Rare means that it happened.
It has once or twice, and I'll tell you the stories, but I think you generally hear a lot more about hecklers than there actually are because, right, to be really specific, right, a heckler is someone who wants to ruin your show and take all of the attention for themselves, right? That's anyone, like if you do a trick badly and someone's like, I saw how you did that, they're not being a heckler. They're just using their brain. You're allowed to do that, right? It's not, in something where I'm showing you the illusion of impossibility, it would be unfair of me to say, by the way, can you just kind of switch off your analytical brain for this? That's not, I think that.
So I do want to have you clarify this line a little bit, because somebody who's seeing your trick and then points it out mid-performance, you wouldn't consider that a heckler?
No, not at all.
That's fair game. You feel, well, I guess I lost this one.
Yep, totally fair game.
So before you go into the heckler stories, like, what do you do with this?
Well, when there are a couple things. Sometimes, often they're wrong, right? The way they think it's done isn't right. There are a lot more ways that magic tricks could theoretically be done than they are actually done. So one option is they're off base. Now, it's a tricky situation because on one hand, if you can disprove their claim, and you have to do so tactfully so it doesn't look like a haha, I'm better than you moment, right? That's good. But the problem is if you create that pattern, then they're going to keep asking questions until eventually you get to a question that you can't answer, right? So that can be a challenge. Sometimes you can incidentally show that it's not the case. Right? Like they're like, there's a face-up card on the bottom of the deck, and you just don't acknowledge them at all. If they're the person next to you, you have to, but if they're out in the crowd, you don't acknowledge them at all. And then as you're making your next gesture or making your comment, you just casually, show the face of the bottom card to everyone, right? And so, first of all, if you don't acknowledge the comment, no one's going to remember it by the end of the performance, unless it's like the very last thing that happened. There's something... there's a great book called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. Yep. And he talks about the peak end rule, which very briefly is people tend to remember disproportionately the end of an experience. And there's some interesting and rather funny experiments he did to confirm that with colleagues. But people primarily remember the end of an experience. And anecdotally, I found that this is very true about magic. If I ask people who saw me perform a year ago, they will basically remember usually the last part of the last trick I did, maybe one other standout moment that probably that happened to them, and the general feeling and vibe of the experience, right? They'll remember basically how they felt and the last thing you did. So if you don't acknowledge a little, issue here or there, an hour later, no one remembers.
It's really the George Costanza rule of leaving.
Right.
What is it? I don't know.
Oh, you'll get it. Yes, you just started watching it. No, he just figured out that he should stop in any aspect of his life, whether it's dating or work. He should just leave when he reaches a high note. If he's in the middle of a meeting and everybody says, "Oh, good idea, George," he just leaves the meeting.
Great, this has been great. Yeah, but that certainly is the case. However, I definitely, to get back to your original question, would not consider that to be them. I mean, if they are trying to constantly at every moment point out their theories about how the tricks are done in a way that's clearly them just trying to take the spotlight, sure, I guess you could call them a heckler. But if you just do something badly and they're like, "Hey, I saw the card in your hand," that's fine. I mean, that's they're allowed to do that. It's like the valid way of experiencing magic, I think. I don't personally find any problem with it. Now, the solution is next time, be better at that thing. But there are certain things that you can not acknowledge because they're really not central to what you're doing. There are certain things that you can kind of incidentally disprove, but it's a sticky territory because you don't want to build that kind of pattern. And then there are certain times where something just completely falls apart. Right. Everyone knows how it's done. And the best and also funniest response is for you to acknowledge that and join the audience in finding some humor in the situation. Just being like, "Well, that didn't work," and, kind of humorously throw the deck of cards over your shoulder and open a new one. Stuff still goes wrong in my shows. I would say actually in every show you ever do, something will go wrong in the sense of something will be unexpected. But we can, and this will also kind of answer the other kind of subtlety of this question, which this will hopefully answer, that in magic, there are two kinds of mistakes. There are mistakes where I know something went wrong before you do, and then there are the mistakes where we both find out it went wrong together. And the first kind of mistake is fine. The second kind of mistake you have to avoid at all costs. So the other thing you do is you build in these little checks, like, okay, the Jack of Clubs better be on the bottom of the deck right now as I'm handing the cards to this person, and the bottom card is visible. Okay, good, it's there. If it's the Seven of Hearts, you've got some stuff you need to do. And that's why you have to have a script and know the whole, structure of the routine and be able to, talk to your audience without using too much of your, mental energy, metaphorically, to focus on that so you can figure out what the heck's going on. So that's a whole element of checks and also making sure that if something's gone wrong. But sometimes things just don't work and it's hilarious and it's part of the experience and you learn to enjoy those moments too.
Mm-hmm. Should we get to the heckler story or?
Oh yeah. I mean, I don't know if I'm sure when I was a little kid, I had, people like just try to grab cards out of my hands or whatever. Because when you're 11 or 12, social norms aren't really there. Or the social norms that are there aren't good ones. Whereas, in a professional performance, it's usually if someone is extremely drunk. Yeah. Sometimes they will just constant basically monologue from the back of the room, sometimes not even related to the show, which is always rather entertaining. And there's a level at which you can play off of it, and there's a lot of ad-libbing and it's funny. But there's also a level where it derails your show. Yeah. And that has happened, and then you just have to ignore them and just finish your act and walk off stage and be like, okay, done. I've had I remember a few years ago, there's this one guy who came up on stage and he was just very drunk and was trying to like grab the props or whatever. And you can very much, what's great is that the pressure from the rest of the audience usually makes them stop doing it. As long as you comport yourself with dignity, the audience will very quickly take your side, as long as you're not, being an ass about it, right? And that pressure, I mean, sometimes like a friend of theirs will literally yell out, "Hey dude, just stop messing up the show," right? That will happen. The audience will see what's going on and they will understand, how to resolve this situation. So often they solve the problem for you, which is pretty funny, especially when it's like their mom who solves the problem. It's always entertaining. But that happens from time to time. But I structure my, if there's a trick where someone's participating a lot, I structure it in a way where there's physical distance between them and the prop they cannot grab right now, so that if worst case scenario, if they try, I will get there first. That's part of it. Also, just setting up a structure of so people understand what their role is in this trick and what they're supposed to be doing, right? Most of the time when an audience member, quote unquote, messes something up on stage, it's not their fault. It's that you as the performer didn't give them clear enough instructions and they just got nervous and missed a step. So most of it's just about clarity.
It's funny because this is actually a great example of the way that social dynamics affect the rest of the audience, or the way that the audience plays on top of each other. Because
exactly,
you are creating a rapport with the audience. Like you're entering a contract where I'm going to give you the illusion that you crave as long as this motherfucker shuts up.
That's what it's not quite what I say in the performance, but it's definitely what I'm thinking. Yes, behind my eyes, that's.
I know, and that's essentially the fact that you say that for the most part they actually play along with this it means that they buy into it. It's an implicit agreement. But obviously, the interesting theme for us is the question of deception and illusion. I want to go back to the idea of, you didn't quite put it like that, but that's how I'm seeing it in my mind. It's almost a competition that audience members have simultaneously with you, as audience members are trying to just put their face in your act and figure out what the hell you're doing, or catch it before it's happened, because everybody has seen magic tricks and they know where this is going. So surely if I pay enough attention, I can catch it before it happens. But at the same time with themselves, and that's the desire to be deceived part, where they are constantly being like, part of your brain's like, don't think too hard.
Right. So to the extent that it is legitimate to think about it as a competition, and you tell me if it is, how many times did you lose that competition? Were you ever caught?
Oh yeah, when I was younger and just learning, of course, especially in middle school, people are ruthless, right? They'll catch you all the time.
No, right, but let's go to your professional.
Oh sure. It's been a
while.
heck of a long time. And I don't say that to be like, it's because I'm so great. It's not that. It's just you learn with time how to cover your bases and what things, like, once you've been caught in all the ways you could be caught during a trick, you stop getting caught in all of those ways until someone finds a new way, which, like, it will happen again, inevitably. And you just have to kind of be ready for that. But in terms of what you were talking about competition, right? I mean, you want to always avoid a sense where it's like a popularity contest or like, haha, I win, you lose. You always want to avoid that on stage, unless that's like a bit and the audience knows it's a bit and it's like a very clearly humorous but good-natured, right? Generally, you really want to avoid like negative forms of conflict, right? Now, of course, you can establish conflict between you and an imaginary character or within a narrative, or sort of mock conflict between you and an audience member where they know it's all fun and games and you're not actually being like, haha, I'm so cool, and you're not. You have to avoid that socially.
So in fact, because what I'm describing is actually not the way that it necessarily plays up in terms of the performance, but the way that the audience often approaches it.
Right.
If I can reinterpret what you're saying that part of the way to diffuse that is to make the audience feel that this is not a competition. We're together. We're in this together. That's
part of it. There's another concept that another term originated by my mentor, which he calls it like psychological surrender, which is, and you need to get to this as fast as possible, which is, you don't want to start out with a trick. I mean, your opener has to, by definition, be the least impressive trick in your whole act. Otherwise, why are you doing something less impressive later, right? It has to build. But the idea is, once the audience realizes they have no chance in the world of figuring out how any of this works, they just stop trying.
Right.
And as soon as they get there, and that's not that they've stopped trying because they decided to kind of throw you a bone and be nice and play along. They stop trying because they realize, there's literally no way I'm going to catch anything this person does. Now I'm along for the ride. Right. And
it's like Tolkien, right? Like suspension of disbelief.
Exactly. It is, Penn and Teller puts this beautifully. He calls magic the unwilling suspension of disbelief, right? Because if you this is not my example. He's given a similar example. But if you go to a play and you see someone fly, you can see the wires. But you knowingly suspend your disbelief and you're like, I'm going to pretend the wires aren't there so I can experience the play. If you go to a magic show and you see someone fly and you can see the wires, it's not a very good magic show, right? Even if you suspect there are wires, they've got to disprove that could possibly be the case, right? So really, some audience members may come into the show with a sort of competitive edge. others won't, right? And these are all, in my mind, perfectly valid ways of approaching a magic show. I don't really, aside from someone who's just trying to ruin the show for everyone, I don't really pass judgment on how people want to engage with magic. I think it's not really my place to do that. Of course, I might have a preference one way or the other, but my preference is actually probably a pretty even split among the audience. I like having some people who really want to figure out how all the tricks work, and some people who are kind of just along for the ride, and then you kind of slowly get people from one camp to the other. But the idea of your first and maybe second tricks are so impossible to figure out that the audience just realizes this is hopeless, and I'm not going to try to. And that some part of their brain kind of is just like, all right, I'm done. I'm checked out.
I'm curious, either in research that you've read, maybe from your more science background, or in experience in maybe smaller settings. I don't think it would apply to larger stage settings, but it seems like we've talked about all the ways that you're kind of manipulating the room, for lack of a better word, and in particular the way that we perceive things. And I think it's about how we, as the norm, quote unquote, perceive things. But I wonder if you've come across people who aren't kind of neurotypical, and if they perceive things differently, and therefore magic lands differently, or they don't misdirect, or they don't spotlight in the way that you expect.
Yeah. So I cannot remember the researcher, but I didn't read, I don't think I read the article, but it was either an abstract or just a headline about, and I don't remember any of the details, but it had to do with some, I don't remember whether it was a developmental or personality thing. I've literally no recollection of what said thing was, but it was some work about people with thing, which I remembered, but unfortunately I don't. Read it on the internet, so it must be true. No, it's from a reputable source, but that they experienced magic differently because they didn't respond to typical social gestures for whatever reason, and as a result, certain types of misdirection weren't very effective because the idea of asking maybe another person a question and then everyone in the room looked at that person expecting to answer them the question, for whatever reason, this individual or this group of individuals that they studied didn't do that as much, or did some percentage less of the time, as always really is the case. I don't remember anything more about that, but broadly, yes, people are doing work like that. I think it's really interesting. And I also think that just anecdotally, that's the other thing that you get a sense for. You look at a room and you start performing, and there are certain people in the audience, and this is not because of any kind of, may have nothing to do with being neurotypical or not, if we're even going to draw that distinction here. This may just be how they are approaching the magic performance, but there are certain people who are just responding to 0% of your misdirection. You're just oh crap, this is going to be, you're going to be a challenge. And you notice that because some people, everyone else is woohoo, and the person's just staring at your hands relentlessly. Right. They won't move their.
This is the kind of people that Adam was mentioning, the ones that are the inner competition, I will not be got.
Right. Transigent. Right. And this is where I mentioned earlier that misdirection is a context, right? That's how I think about it, because it's not just look over here while I do something else over here. It's that, right? Because if you realize you've been misdirected, it didn't work, right? Even if you missed the thing that happened, if you realize that you missed something, that's bad. I messed up somewhere. So what's really important is that you are able to create a sort of modified or manipulated kind of frame of reference for your audience, where they always think they are watching the most important thing, right? From their perspective, to follow what's going on, to see how the trick's done, to experience whatever is happening, right? That they are always following the single most important thing, right? And as long as they are operating under that illusion, misdirection's easy, right? If I'm all right, here's the deck of cards, it's really important that you shuffle these cards well, and I want to make sure that you shuffle them as thoroughly as possible, right? Everyone's going to look at you, and you now know, mixing these cards, this really matters. Let's focus on this. It might be the case that I really couldn't care less if those cards are shuffled or not, but that is a distraction.
I want you to expand on this idea of frame of reference and how you think about it, but also throw in this something that I was thinking of before. When we were thinking about the difference between basically the two elements of manipulation, which one of them is excluding seeing certain things, basically, or putting things outside of your field of vision, and also focusing your field of vision, making sure that you do notice this action and not something else. Obviously, they relate. This is something that unfortunately I had to think a lot about working in the media, and something that we talk a lot about in the podcast. When I worked in many outlets in the past 10 years, the way we thought about stories that we would publish, first of all, the most important thing about the story, above the the journalistic integrity and value of the news itself, was whether somebody's going to click into the story, whether somebody's going to read it, which means that packaging takes priority. The image, the headline, all that. This is not new. This has been the truth of journalism since forever. Now you can measure the effect more immediately, whereas 70 years ago, you would just assume based on circulation that you were doing a good job or not. Now you actually know how many people click to a specific story, so you can turn the art of framing and attention grabbing to like an actual science.
Which has a parallel, I would imagine, with magic going online and YouTube videos.
Yep, exactly. Yeah. No, but specifically, I remember that one of the things that I found both thrilling and corrupt and disgusting was that the terminology that would be used in many of the newsrooms wasn't even whether or not the framing is good or not even effective, was does it force you to click? Yeah. And I found that fascinating because the idea it's not good enough to create a headline that is interesting or captivating. It needs to force you to click. It needs to make it physically impossible for you to not read the rest. It would be like, bum, ba, ba, bum, bum. That's it. Yeah. I hijacked your brain.
Right.
And that's the way they would talk about it. So I'm throwing this to you. But
yeah. So this is more of a kind of just random theory on my end. And like many things in the world of, neuroscience, right? You can be like, we know about this kind of process and this process, and there's this thing we noticed. Those are probably analogous. And you can say that with the word probably until you do a lot of very complicated research to, draw a causal connection there. So this is correlative and more of a kind of idea on my end that I think would be interesting to research. When we talk about, so for a little context, during college, I was contacted by two researchers. They are neuropsychiatrists, one from Harvard and one from Duke, and they emailed me and said, hey, we are going to put on a talk about the science of magic for this neuroscience conference, and we need a magician with a neuroscience background who can help us, demonstrate some of the stuff in the talk, but who also speaks a common language. And it was like, there's my niche. Yay, right? We prepped the talk, and then COVID happened, got delayed a year, but we gave the talk in 2021. Yes.
What is time?
2021. God, everything blurs together.
Yeah.
Jeez. Okay. But we gave the talk, went really well. I learned, obviously I was able to sort of fill in their gaps in terms of their knowledge of magic, and I learned so much more about those areas of neuroscience than I ever learned in college. So that was fascinating. And I subsequently, someone who saw that talk, they run a neuroscience kind of public-facing journal called Cerebrum, which I then wrote an article for that came out last year. One idea that was covered in another portion of the talk was the idea of attentional capture, how that works. And there's one idea which is called top-down versus bottom-up attentional capture, which is a really interesting concept, right? So one example would be to say, like, all right, now let's all look at this wine glass, right? Which is like you're just deciding consciously to look at the wine glass. That's one option.
That's top down?
Yeah, we'd call that top down. Another option is something,
I thought you were doing
this,
it literally. That was
which
it?
is dropping my wallet. Where you are not. So what happened there is I had my wallet in my hand and I dropped it. It hit Adam's foot and fell to the floor, making a sound. And all of us looked at it. You because you felt the wallet, and you because you heard the wallet. And we would call this bottom up because you are not consciously going, I want to direct my attention here. Your attention is pulled by some kind of stimulus, right? And I think that this idea of top-down versus bottom-up attentional capture, I can't say for sure whether the brain mechanisms that underlie that are the same brain mechanisms that underlie certain parts of social media and also certain parts of misdirection. But I think it's somewhat likely that they do, and here's why. Right, so when we are talking about you deciding to direct your attention somewhere, right? If I'm like, now look at this card, it's really important. You are not inclined to trust me in a magic performance, right? But if I have you pick a card and I show you the card, it's really important that you remember this card because there's not going to be a card trick later if you don't remember it, right? it's now clear to all of you that this is actually a really important piece of information. But this is very much kind of a top-down type thing, right?
You've created the circumstances under which it is imperative for you to remember the card for the audience to remember.
Exactly. And that's different, of course, from dropping a glass on the ground and it shatters and everyone looks at it, right? But the idea is, if I'm going to misdirect you, right, I either have to disguise some form of bottom-up attentional capture as being top-down. In other words, I have to disguise a moment where your attention is grabbed without your, initial kind of conscious thought, as a case where you did direct your attention there, consciously. And I'm using the word conscious, and I'm using the word conscious here, and it's always important to distinguish. The word unconscious has a lot of baggage. You'll usually hear me say non-conscious just to distinguish those two things, but I'm not even... For the people who care, I'm not even choosing a frame of reference in which to talk about conscious and non-conscious actions or thought. I'm just using those very vaguely right now.
What we learned from Emma and Zev, right? It's exclamation mark equal sign.
Right. Yeah. So that's just to kind of put a pin in that. You guys can include that or not. It's really
We will definitely include it.
Yes. But I'm not picking any specific definitions here, to be clear.
Right.
But so just vaguely and broadly. Right. If I can disguise a moment of misdirection as a moment of you guys, choosing where to put your attention. And what we realize when we think about this is that all misdirection is actually direction. It's not a case of, I don't want you to look here, look anywhere else. That doesn't really work. It's that I don't want you to look here, so I'm going to get all of you to turn your attention here, because either I look there or, and often all of the context that I've built says that this is the most important place to look, so that even if you're someone who's trying to catch me out and figure out how the trick works, this is the spot that you think you should be looking in order to do that, right? So it's a contextual thing. But I think a lot of this also happens in social media, right? Because especially with recommendation algorithms, which is how most of YouTube and many other apps work, right? When I open up my YouTube recommended page, right, that algorithm knows me so well, and it knows what kinds of thumbnails and what kinds of titles and which people I'm most likely to click on videos. And so I'm left thinking, I chose to watch this video today, but how much real choice I had in that is debatable. So whether these are actually all the same psychological or neuroscientific phenomenon, I don't know, but I think it would be really interesting to investigate whether they are the same phenomenon.
And even if they're not specifically the same phenomenon in terms of the neurological processes that affect them, we just know that, broadly speaking, attentional capture is a shared phenomenon. Philosophically, this is such a deep question when we're talking. I tried to not bring social media. I was talking broadly media, but obviously it was implicit in my context. But even when we're talking about social media, very much so. The idea of loss of free will, this is just something that we talk about a lot in the podcast, because media and the dissemination of information is a big part of what drives us to outrage, I think, on our pod, or fist shaking.
Of course.
And in the context of social media, it's just phenomenal how much political power these invisible attention capturers have. But it's interesting to note that this is not a unique thing. Maybe the scale of social media is, but the way we do it, you don't even need to be a magician to know that we are just exploiting the ability to distract people, even in conversation. And but even easy, if you go to all the history of con men and populism throughout history, it's all about knowing how to activate very similar parts of our collective experiences.
Right.
But even in just interpersonal conversations, we do that, and that's the art of manipulation. And even if somebody steps into our conversation that you're not comfortable with, everybody has developed their own strategies of how to deflect from it. They know what expression to put on. The art of misdirection, broadly defined, and whether or not they're playing on the same process, is just part of our human experience. It's like being in a society or being in contact with other people is the art of trying to control your partner's attention to some extent. Right. So I know you're being scientific about this. I'm being a journalist, which means I'm taking a lot of shit and putting onto the same category. But I think, in truth, whether or not it's the same thing, in the most rigorous sense, this is what makes us so captivated with magic. Because you mentioned the word surrender at some point, but this is where we effectively surrender ourselves to feeling that, and people like to surrender. That's the whole, again, drawing in the idea of politics. People pretend that they like freedom and choice and all that, but essentially, we really love, in some primordial way, that feeling of something just happened that we don't understand, we had no control over, and it just drew us and controlled us. And that's why we like charismatic leaders. That's why we like superstars and bigger than life characters and artists, and that's why we like magic.
Right.
There's just something very human about that desire to manipulate on one hand and be manipulated on the other.
Right.
That is my journalistic thesis. That's how you write an op-ed.
You need precious few citations and scientific rigor, and just done. Send it.
Yeah, and here I can't get through a certain sentence without being like, well, by the way, what this doesn't mean is this, and this.
Audio footnote.
Yes, exactly. So no, it's just different ways of thinking about the same thing. Oh, speaking of the packaging that you mentioned earlier about, that there's the creator of Patreon, a guy named Jack Conti, also part of the band Pomplamoose.
I didn't know the guy who was in Pomplamoose is the
Yeah,
creator
Jack
of
Conti,
Patreon.
bald guy with a big beard.
Wow.
He's the co-founder.
Co-founder of Patreon. He's
Yep.
not a creator on Patreon.
No, he is
creator
the
of Patreon.
co-founder of Patreon.
I wonder if he started it because Pomplamoose wanted more. Yeah.
Yep, they started it because I think, vaguely, they didn't want to have to sign to a record label and have that restriction. So they're a very successful band, but they have never signed with a label, as far as I know. So anyway, he talked in an interview about something that was really interesting, which is, okay, if you're a person doing some kind of craft or art or whatever thing on the internet, right? Of course, you would like to maintain some kind of artistic integrity, whatever that means, but also you want people to watch your stuff, right? So you have to identify for yourself, what are the factors or variables that are at the core of what you do, and you will never compromise on these. And then what things are just the wrapping paper? What's the packaging, and you could care less, right? So you will tailor those to whatever performs best. So he talked about, again, I saw this years ago, so I'm sure I misremember lots of this. But in this interview, talked about how for him, like, the arrangement and the musicality and a bunch of all that stuff is super important. But what he doesn't really care about is which songs they play. It's not very important to him. The song choice is not nearly as important. So they cover a lot of very popular songs, right? Those songs are innately going to be viewed more than if they did a very niche song no one's ever heard of, right? So he's identified for himself, what are the things where I will give it my all artistically, and what are the things where I will kind of be swayed by whatever performs well. And so I've had to think a lot about that, doing magic on YouTube and trying to get, what is fundamentally close-up magic meant to be done for other people in a small room to work, on video where people can't fundamentally interact. And you have to think about, well, what's at the core of what I do, and I won't compromise on that. And then what are the things where I am willing to kind of just make changes and see what performs well. So that's been really interesting. And I think I kind of take a similar, like the construction of the trick and how tight and, everything it is. That's all super important to me. But less important is specifically which tricks I do.
What do you feel is most compromised by translating magic to YouTube?
Well, I think the thing that's really compromised is not something that you could possibly fix, because it's just the fact that you lose the interaction. Right? If you don't have that interaction with the audience, and you don't have the real byplay, and you can't have them physically reach into the deck and do something as simple as pick a card, right? With all of these things, you are losing an interactive human element, right? And that is really hard to kind of recreate in any meaningful way. Even if you perform it for another person on video, it's not like the viewer's part of that interaction.
Right.
So
It also kind of potentially puts up another layer of
Yes.
disbelief, because
Yep.
it's like, well, you could doctor that.
yes, you could do. Yes, exactly. I have, like, my most popular YouTube video. It was one of the early ones that I released, and I didn't realize it is a single take, right? Like, it is it's shot with 3 cameras, but it's a single take with 3 cameras, and I cut between the cameras. But those cuts are they do not obscure any sleight of hand. They're not jumping around. It is a continuous sequence. It's just so that you're always watching from the camera, where it's actually easiest to see what's happening. What I didn't realize at the time, being inexperienced at making YouTube videos, is that people would think that I use those camera cuts not to help them see the action, but actually to, distract or hide stuff. So he was littered with comments about like, oh, this is... Now, luckily, I have other videos where I actually do the same trick or a similar trick for a live audience in one take. But, that doesn't prevent people from being suspicious. Now, that's fine. Okay, they can be suspicious. But it's like, I've now learned that if I'm going to shoot a video with multiple cameras, I should say, that... Right. It is very helpful to have multiple camera angles because sometimes you just need to look really closely at the cards to appreciate what's happening. But I have to choose the proper times in the video to switch angles so that even if I had used that camera cut to hide something, which I don't, but even if I had, it wouldn't explain the trick that happens next, that all of the relevant context is present in one continuous shot from that camera. I just have to keep that in mind.
We'll talk about YouTube. So my brief experience with the magic world made me really appreciate just how much of a guild almost a community is. First of all, you mentioned a lot of names. You name dropped a bunch, which implies just how close and small the community is. But also, there is a lot of strong honor code that brings it together, right? That the idea that obviously you don't share the secrets because that defeats the point. It's tinged with guildiness in it, right? To what extent? First of all, tell me if that's even true. I mean, I was always brought on that impression, but if it's true, how much does YouTube and the internet disrupt that?
Well, I think Magic used to be more guild-like than it is now because YouTube in, I think 2005, when it started, it changed everything, right? Because now, for a lot of magic tricks, you can just look them up on YouTube and find a 15-year-old kid in his bedroom explaining how they work.
And, for our Zoomer and under listener, actually, are you a Zoomer, Daniel, or a borderline millennial?
I was born in 1996, so I'm the exact borderline between Gen Z and millennial.
Oh, really? Goes that far?
That is the 1996 is like the last year of millennial, but the first year of Gen Z, I think, when I look it up. So I'd like to think of myself as a millennial. Well, I'm a millennial insofar as I use primarily YouTube, not TikTok.
Oh, yeah, there you go.
I identify myself by my social media app of choice.
Yeah. To in the same way that we are, I guess, culturally more Gen X than we are millennials, despite a 10-year difference. Anyway, back in the day, when you wanted to actually see magic explained or exposed, there was this dude in a mask that had a special like NBC or Fox News. It's called Breaking the Magician's Code. I don't know how much of it was staged or not. I mean, it was a staged event, obviously. But there was an idea that this is not something that you commonly do. You don't just go about explaining some of the biggest tricks in magic. It's a somewhat shameful thing to do. At least, even if it was done with the artist's consent, it was still important that publicly it was communicated as taboo. But now anybody who has enough knowledge of magic can just go on YouTube and share it with everyone.
So I don't know too much about the whole Masked Magician saga. That was kind of before my time, but it was definitely not with the consent of the creators, and the magic community did not look fondly upon him. And I
remember there was again, I didn't know how much of it was real, but there was a response to anybody. Anybody who's interested, this was probably the most dramatic moment in
the 90s magic world.
There was a response video of the magician community when they exposed the exposer.
Yes.
And it was a whole event. Yeah. It was fun.
Yeah. YouTube changed everything, so when I was 10 when I started, which means it was 2006, so YouTube already existed. You could already at that point look up how tricks were done on YouTube, but I got very lucky that the owner of the magic shop in San Francisco, it's called Misdirections Magic Shop, actually, and the owner, Joe Pon, fantastic mentor, great broad knowledge base, and really impressed the importance of learning through like legitimate sources, Now, sure, YouTube has and other social media apps, but primarily YouTube has vastly expanded the accessibility of magic. People who live in places where it was really hard to buy magic books or couldn't afford them because they're not cheap, now have access to learning about magic, which is awesome. The less awesome side is that most of the teaching that's done on YouTube isn't so great, and also a lot of it is just how the tricks are done. Now, there's somewhat of a generational gap in how magicians...
By which you mean it's more of just exposing without actually explaining.
Right. This is the secret, not here's how to mechanically do this, and all of the, variables that follow. So there's a bit of a generational divide in magic about how people view this. Some people view YouTube is entirely a bad thing. Some people view it as entirely a good thing. Some people view it as, somewhere in the middle. And I think there are arguments to be made on all sides here. And the way I see things is good, bad, or otherwise. It's not like we can go back in time. So
Very Welchy.
Very Matt Welchy.
it's just an irreparable change, which means if you do a sort of standard magic trick that's very easy to describe in a sentence, right? Someone can go on the internet and look it up and find out how, not necessarily how you did the trick, but how a trick like that can be done as explained by a 12-year-old in his mom's bedroom, right? On a, crappy camera from 10 years ago, right? That's a thing. So, I think that really changes things. People also learn a lot from there, and the teaching is kind of a hodgepodge. So sometimes they learn something really great, other times not so much. But on the flip side, right, there's lots of old footage of some of the great sleight of hand masters of times past. Fred Capps, Steve Vernon, Ed Marlowe, Ricky Jay, etc., etc. The list goes on, and all of this performance footage is on YouTube, which is an incredible resource. I mean, there are certain shows of these people that have been immortalized on YouTube, and I've watched some of these like hundreds of times because it's just a gold mine of. And this is not about how the tricks work. This is just watching them perform for a live audience and learning so much from it. So I actually made a playlist on my channel of 52, because 52 cards in a deck, videos that you should watch. And I think it's just called Magic You Should Watch, and it's just 52 videos of performances on YouTube that I think would be really valuable to anyone who either does magic or just likes watching it. I think that definitely are some, perks and drawbacks to that. Of course, for me personally, there's been a lot of perks because YouTube has really helped to kickstart some of my career. So I benefit from this, bit of a conflict of interest in anything I say here, because I certainly benefit from YouTube.
What's the most, angry, strongest reaction against YouTube that you've encountered?
Well, that it sort of is degrading magic, and that it cheapens magic, and all of YouTube is just exposure, and there's nothing good about it, and anything posted about magic on the internet is sort of a, cardinal sin against, the purity of the art form.
Are there clubs that won't host you if you went on YouTube, or?
I don't know, actually. These days, probably not. It used to be the case that certainly, I mean, I don't remember the details, but I think Penn and Teller at one point were banned from the Magic Circle because they revealed a trick in part of their act, but it was a bit sort of. But then they're also so big that it doesn't matter to them, right? They're Penn and Teller, right? You can do whatever they want. So
Canceling the uncancelable.
Yeah, it's exactly. And so it's just I think that, I mean, no one in their right mind would say that YouTube is that social media is just gonna go away. So you have to work with it, right? For example, if you really want, some magicians, and I think this is a fair perspective, are okay if they do tricks and the audience then goes home and looks them up and figures out how the trick worked. Some people are just look, I want them to experience magic in the moment. If they figure it out later on their own time, doing their own research, fine. That's an occupational hazard. I take a different, and I really think that's a fair perspective, and there's a good argument to be made for that. I take a different perspective, which is I want to make it as hard as possible for people to figure out how the tricks are done after the show. I want it to be really, really, really difficult to go look these up and find a satisfying explanation, right? Sure, you might look up a trick and find some kind of explanation, but hopefully, knowing what you'll find on the internet when you look it up, I've done enough in the show to make it clear that I could not have done the trick that way.
Does that mean that also does that also change the general language of magic, knowing that so many of the fundamentals are already available for whoever searches them up? Does it make you start looking for ways to conceal that, tricks that cannot be easily explained, or developing personalized skills that nobody can imitate?
Or put in another way, can you try create something new?
Of course, yeah. Yes.
No, but I'm thinking something new that also is not just using those old pieces that
Sure.
are the building blocks that a lot of old magic is based on. Something
The way I think about it, well, first of all creativity in magic, as other things, is iterative. It is exceedingly rare that someone has an idea that is completely new and is based not at all on any kind of preceding work. That virtually never happens, and all creativity, whether or not you know it at the time of having the idea, is iterative. And most ideas you have in magic, someone else had 100 years ago. But, you know, there's certainly ground to be covered. But the way I like to think about dealing with the way the internet is these days is the idea of layering, right? If I just do a trick and there's only one method to it, if you figure that method out either in the room or later on, like, you know, trick's over. But if I can layer 5 or 6 different things, even if you could individually find those things, if I can layer them together, then it's going to be a lot harder for people to work out, presumably. So I think that's one way of approaching it, is just that kind of layering.
Just to conclude this topic, you do every once in a while, and I'm very grateful for that, reveal small magic tricks on your channel. How do you decide which magic tricks to reveal and which not?
Yeah, I one thing, for example, that's really, we were talking about packaging a little bit ago, about what things are things where I won't compromise, right? Like, I do not really ever want my channel to become a magic tutorial channel where all I do is expose and teach magic tricks, right? Like, there's a whole discussion to be had. Lots of people who do that, and there's a whole discussion to be had about whether that's inherently good or bad, or do they do it well or not. And that's a complex topic that I just don't really care to get involved in, because I don't know if there's really good answers to a lot of those questions. However, without necessarily passing judgment on that one way or the other, I just don't want my channel to be that, because I just want it to be about something else. I just make it clear that that's not a value judgment about the different ways that people run channels. It's just a personal taste thing. I think that for me, like, I'm okay talking about magic and explaining things that are kind of around magic, like explain some of the, you know, science around them or some of the principles around them, right? But with one or two exceptions, there are 2 or 3 videos on my channel where I actually truly teach a trick. Right? I think there are 3 of them right now. And I picked those tricks very carefully because they're tricks that, if you, like, these are not like deep trade secrets. You can find these on the internet, right? But I felt like I wanted to teach them in a more nuanced way where someone could actually pick up a deck of cards and actually learn it. And based on the comments, I get people actually have done that, which is cool, right? And I get like, oh, I did this and I did it for my dad or my daughter or whatever, and they really liked it. And, you know, quarantine's been so boring or like stressful, and this really helped. It's like, cool, awesome, love it. So, right, I've done 3 of those, and, you know, maybe I'll do another one someday, but I really can't see myself doing much more of that.
So the standard for you there was those are already available. They're there, and I'm just going to do it a little better.
They're available enough, and I can teach a version that's especially easy to learn, but also that if you watch those videos, none of the principles that I explain there, like, if you go watch a good close-up magician, knowing how those 3 tricks work is not going to help you at all, right? Like, these are either principles that a good magician would already layer in, or just wouldn't use, or would use in different... So, you know, it's just not so much of a concern. But in general, I'm fine talking about, like, topics around magic. Like, for example, especially when we talk about gambling sleight of hand, right? It's no secret that I can, you know, deal off the bottom of the deck, right? I talk about this in my live performances all the time. So to say, well, now I'm going to demonstrate how I deal off the bottom of the deck, and I'll talk about all the theory around that might be interesting to people, right? This is not exposing or like ruining magic tricks, right? First of all, conceptually, you can imagine that people can do that, right? It's not something that you don't know of. And if the technique is done really well, it doesn't matter that you know it exists. You can't see it. You just cannot detect it, and you won't know it's happening. So there's certain topics where I'm okay giving a little more information. I'm not teaching people how to do it. Like, I do not, that would be a very different video, and I have an online course where I do teach it. Shameless plug. But it's a very different approach when I'm teaching how something is done versus I'm just talking about it.
Just to tie this into the beginning of the conversation, I wasn't, when I was talking about you teaching magic tricks, I wasn't talking about you talking about the deals. I was talking about the actual tricks. But it's absolutely true. I remember watching your videos about the second deal and the bottom deal, and it really, what's so beautiful about this is that no matter how much you tell us what you do, you can't see it. Literally in close up, the actual camera is zoomed in and you can't see it, and that's what made me want to have this conversation about attention in the first place. So answer this question to the extent that you're obviously comfortable with.
Sure.
But when you have tricks like this, and I'm assuming that there are tricks that are way more elaborate than this, how many possibilities do you need to keep track of in your mind? How do you keep track of the fucking Like the permutations and the dialogue trees that you have to follow.
Yes, that can take some practice. So there's certain tricks where it seems like there are lots of ways it can go, and there's really only one way it can go. But there are other tricks where it can go a lot of ways, and part of it is you just have to practice. Like, there are certain tricks where you fundamentally can't practice them without a willing audience member to help you out, because you literally need another human in the room to just make random choices so that you have to steer the ship in whatever way. But a big part of this is sort of the setting, right? I get to like design my own theater show and have a set and assistants and everything. I can give you a lot more freedom because I have so many more methods at my disposal when I control every aspect of the lighting and the seating and all that, right? Of course, the less control I have, or the less control it seems that I have over the circumstance, then there are fewer options available to me. But we call these outs, where right? An out basically is a different way that a trick could end. So it might be that, and we use these in two contexts. One is there's a trick where there are just 6 equally likely endings, for example, and I can get to any of them, right? But there are other cases where this is plan A, and then there's an asterisk, and here's plan B, C, D, E, and F in case plan A doesn't work, right? But of course, what the audience never knows is whether plan A happened or not.
And part of the aesthetic, I call it aesthetic because that's the word that I always go to. I think I told you this. 2 of our recurring guests, Daniel, are I guess she's not a recurring. She's a recurring guest in our household. But Batya Ungar Sargon is one, and Misha Thomas is another. Batya Ungar Sargon is the deputy opinion editor at Newsweek, and Misha is a group psychologist, brilliant guy. And a dialogue that we have between the 3 of us is that Misha is obsessed with psychology, so he interprets every political, social, cultural problem through that lens. Batya is obsessed with class. So everything is that why people voted for Trump, why people are angry in the Huzamabab, whatever. It's class. And for me, it's aesthetic. Everything is aesthetic motivation or cultural motivations.
And for me, everything's just, how is this a card trick? That's my lens. Or how is this sleight of hand? Yeah.
Right.
But my point is that, so the aesthetic part of magic that always mind boggles me, and this is kind of the level in which I like to keep the illusion without necessarily thinking past that, is the lack of knowledge and the uncertainty of whether, when you chose 9, did Daniel control the deck to fit your choice of 9, or did Daniel control you to choose 9? And that's the question that always mystifies me in Magic, and I don't really want the answer. I love that mystery. Did he make you choose 9, or did he change the physical world to fit your choice? And that fascinates me.
And there are 2 other permutations where I controlled both of them, or I controlled neither, and I just got really lucky.
It's the Jack Sparrow option. Jack Sparrow is the 4th permutation. Does he plan this, or does he just get lucky? So I guess the thing that I want to ask you before, and now it actually flows comfortably, is that issue of mentalism. We slightly talked about this earlier this week at a bar, but how much of that plays in, which is basically the side of the equation where you control the person.
Yeah, mentalism is it's sort of, so it's its own genre of magic is the best way of describing it, right? The same way that, for example, classical music is a genre of music, or jazz or whatever, right? Just like close-up or sleight of hand type of stuff is another genre. These are very loosely defined genres. So mentalism is a very broad term involving where I apparently read your mind, or I apparently influence you to do something, or I apparently, do whatever. Now, a lot of mentalism grows out of the fraudulent psychic mediums, right? Which were, right. Obviously, there were a lot of con men who were, doing things with cards, 3-card Monty, cheating at cards, right? This was a totally different type of con. All of the fraudulent psychic mediums of the 1800s, starting with the Fox sisters in 1848 and the whole spiritualism movement and whatnot. So, that's a whole tradition that mentalism has grown out of. And mentalism is tricky because, right, when you're presenting mentalism, I think you have to be very careful. because if you present mentalism as mind reading and you claim that you really can do it and that you really are reading people's minds, right? There is a certain percentage of people
Who are actually going to believe you, right? Take it at face value, no matter how much you're going to telegraph and broadcast that this is an illusion, this is fake, the mind reading, the psychism, this is all just an aesthetic choice. This is not real. But no matter how clearly you're going to communicate that, there will be people who will still convince themselves that it's real. Take you literally and not seriously, or however you want to flip that metaphor.
And furthermore, there's a great researcher. I recommend everyone should read this book if they're interested in this kind of thing, in magic and psychology. It's called Experiencing the Impossible, The Science of Magic. It's by a researcher named Gustav Kuhn, who's from the UK, Goldsmiths University. Great research, and he does research about magic and psychology, and it's great. I love his work. He, is incredibly knowledgeable about this, and I learned a lot from reading his book on this. It is written for the non-scientist, but it is written in such a way that if you have any kind of science background, it's still written for you. It's got all the levels of depth that you might want. He actually did this experiment. I might not remember the details perfectly, but a lot of people who do mentalism include what they would call a disclaimer in their act, where their disclaimer is, this isn't real. I don't actually have psychic powers. I'm just making it seem that way through whatever methods. And whether or not the methods they give you about how they create the impression of being psychic are even true, they're at least owning up to the fact that it's not all real, which is a step in the right direction. However, he surveyed people about, after they saw someone do some mentalism, about whether they believed this was, he got their initial opinions about what they think is, real or not. And then after seeing them, what do you think is real or not? And then there was, with or without a disclaimer, and it basically doesn't make a difference. Really? Because
and presumably a large percentage of these people were persuaded after the show that mentalism is real,
or that at least this individual has some form of real supernatural powers, right? And basically, it just did not. It just didn't make a difference because...
But was his superpower defined as just his extraordinary ability to actually read people, which could just be, high emotional intelligence, or the same way that we are all mind readers, that we're able to pick up on some physical cues, and to the extent that a person is exceptional at this kind of reading, it could come across as actually magic or supernatural.
And that's often given as sort of a secondary explanation, but even that, you can't actually read people's minds by looking at their body language. Right. It's not a real thing. You can create the impression of that in magic, but like, for example, with mentalism, right? Some mentalists are like, I can read your mind. And other mentalists are like, no, I don't read your mind. I'm just reading your body language. That's not to...
Even that's an overstatement.
That's also not true.
So you're saying Sherlock is a fictional character?
Sherlock Holmes is very much a fictional character. Now, again, the thing is, right, like, I don't have a problem saying that because I say the same thing about all the magic I do, right? I don't claim to have supernatural powers with cards. Now, there's a really key difference here. If I convince someone that I can do something with a deck of cards that's not possible, and they actually go out into the world with that false belief, that does not negatively impact their everyday life. But if someone goes out into the world really believing that psychics exist, they become much easier for a fraudulent psychic to prey upon in a time of vulnerability. That's where this stops being a fun, philosophical, well, I'm being 80% truthful. What about you? Oh, I'm being 75% truthful. That's all fun and games. I think there's arguments to be made both ways, right? But where it stops being that is when people become actually more vulnerable to con artists.
Now you're exploiting the person's deepest weaknesses.
Right. And I would not want to contribute to someone falling victim to that experience by providing some evidence that they were looking for, that there really are supernatural powers. I wouldn't want to create that impression. Now, that said, I think personally that given what I've learned about neuroscience, the actual explanations, again, not all of how they work, but giving, 10, 20, 30% of it away, I think that the actual explanations for how close-up magic and how mentalism works are more interesting than the often kind of cover-up fake methods, like I can read your body language. It's like, well, no, that's not how this works. Sure, there are certain things where body language reading plays a very small role, but it's like a very minor role. There's other stuff going on, right? But the thing is that I think that being able to reveal a little bit about some of like the other context, like, okay, I don't have psychic powers, but what's making it feel like I really am? Like, what's the context I'm creating? How can I talk about that? You can talk about that in interesting ways without spoiling the fun. The problem with all of this, of course, is that as soon as you give away too much, it stops being magic anymore, and then it's not entertaining. And so if you are aiming to entertain people, you have to strike a balance between, you have to think for yourself about, okay, what level of like brute honesty or not am I comfortable with, right? Am I comfortable leaving people with a view that they didn't hold beforehand, or, being open to that possibility? Am I comfortable with that actually being a potentially harmful view to hold out in the world? Do I really worry about, I'm not speaking for myself here. I'm, as a hypothetical person asking these questions, I have thought a lot about this, and then also, how much can I give away before it just is boring, right? And how much can I give away before it just sounds like I'm disproving things and that's not so fun? So, there are people who handle this in a variety of different ways, and they answer these questions for themselves. And I think if you're going to like take being a magician if you're going to do the mentalism side of things, you need to really think about this carefully, I think, beforehand, before you decide to do it. And I have friends who take radically different approaches to this, right? Like, I have friends in magic who are like super duper, I will never ever lie to them about anything, and other friends who are like way more lax about that. And I've heard them all articulate what I think are good, convincing arguments. Whether I buy into them or not, requires a long discussion and some analysis. But like, this is not an instance where there's like one obvious right answer, and I don't want to imply that that's the case, because I would be doing a disservice to the complexity of the issue and like the contexts in which one is appropriate or not. So I just say that because while I think in what I say it's probably semi-clear where I land on this debate, I don't want to come off as saying that this is the only perspective. Right. There are other perspectives that I've heard good arguments for. I don't frequently hear good arguments for them, but I have heard them.
Well, yeah. I mean, I've heard a lot of great arguments for media practices that I find below the pale.
Yeah. So I think that's... mentalism is...
Something with a pale.
Tricky. And because I have some legitimacy of like actually at least having studied neuroscience at like a, well-known college, it's like that lends extra credibility. So I have to be even more careful about what I present, because people might take that as like having some academic weight behind it. And my aim is not to be like, I studied neuroscience at Penn, so I can read your mind. It's like, no, I actually have some real understanding of how magic operates at the level of the brain, and at least can maybe pose interesting questions for so much that we don't understand. And I think that's actually a lot more interesting than the kind of smoke and mirrors that often takes its place.
So last question, time for you to drink.
Last question.
Oh, yes. Thank you. This is mine, I believe. Yes. Cheers. I will finally allow myself to imbibe.
Now that the trick is done.
Yes, yes. Now they're going to ask the really hard-hitting questions.
So who did you vote for? Is it the magic trick that you were worried about in terms of drinking, or the questions?
I just wanted to... some of both. I mean, like, I just want to be able to, like, give you guys, like, interesting answers. And I found that in the past, however much being tipsy makes me think I'm giving good answers in the moment, it doesn't lead to me giving like good, interesting, lucid answers when I listen to myself the next day.
Right.
And the same is true of magic. Yes. Having a glass of wine with friends is great, but if I need to like think about things in a way that will sound good to sober me tomorrow, it's, good for me to have not imbibed at all. And like, if I'm performing especially if I'm doing a formal performance, I never ever drink before performing, because it's just, I have to be so...
Yeah, but that's also like a long... How long is your performance?
Well, it varies. Sometimes you're booked for like 30 minutes, other times you're booked for over an hour, right? It totally depends on the venue. Sometimes it's like Strolling Magic, an event that's multiple hours long, right?
Like you could have a booth in an event.
Yeah, just that kind of thing can happen as well. So it really varies, but I'm also not really much of a drinker.
I find podcasts I could probably get away with a little bit tipsy, although the one time I got drunk, I'm glad we didn't air that episode.
Oh yeah.
But with singing, because we also do music. Oh my God, I can't hear pitch as well. It's shocking.
It's actually interesting for me. It's less the motor skills that go with magic. Like I've probably put about 20,000 or so hours into practicing sleight of hand and magic throughout my life. So I could probably Like, I've definitely, in my college days at some parties was still able to do some magic very late at night or very early in the morning, which is weird. Was I able to coherently talk through those? No. So I find that actually I think the thing to really emphasize here is that there is a humongous amount of mental agility that's required to perform magic, where I am, like, there's a lot I'm having to keep track of with the cards and with managing the audience members. And also be present, listen to what you're saying, respond to what's going on, all of that jazz. So it's like there's so much that I'm having to attend to at any one time and flip back and forth between lots of different things. I gotta be on. So being mentally agile is critical.
Yep. What's your last question, Ida?
Let me think about this for a second.
It's funny. I initially was planning to just do the first one with the card and the number that you where you said a card and said a number. But as I was coming over here, I first of all kind of anticipating what we were going to talk about. Yeah. Just wild guess. I thought, the Scout Mindset and Elephant in the Brain. These are going to be interesting books. If they haven't read them, I think you guys will get some fun out of them. So enjoy the read. Two of my favorite books of the last year. But in addition, as I was coming over with those books in hand, I was like, oh wait, there's that book trick. I haven't done that for about 3 months. I wonder if I can remember enough of how to do that one to do it on the podcast.
This is neither the questions from my phone nor what I was going to ask you about mentalism, but just because you mentioned book trick, what's the name of that I guess is a mentalist? That guy who's really good at talking about magic, and the sort of illusion of magic. He's bald, long hair, eloquent, talented mentalist.
Did long hair?
I think he has like bald but long hair.
If he's just bald, you might be talking about Darren Brown. If he's bald with long hair, you could be talking about Max Maven potentially.
Maven, yes, Maven.
Max Maven. Ah, yeah. Wow, you are a connoisseur of magic. Yeah, you really are. Okay.
Maven. I remember he had an old performance. Actually, I guess it was more recent than his older performance, because he seemed older himself. In some event, and part of the trick was reading excerpts from a book on a particular page and a particular topic. But the person that he brought on to the stage wasn't an English speaker. So she was having difficulty actually reading the words. And like you, the words were part of the mystique of the performance.
Right.
And it was completely lost on her.
Oh,
and
interesting.
she actually missed some of the prompts. And that just like connected to Vanessa's question. She asked specifically about neurotypical audience members, but more broadly, like when you encounter cross-cultural or certain disabilities or anything that makes the language of magic not translate. Is that something that you've encountered?
Oh, yeah. So I would lump all of these into what I would kind of describe as like logistical things, like in a performance, right? Because, someone not being like exactly who you're looking for on stage in a way that's not their fault can happen for a million reasons, right? And like, again, a lot of your questions, rightfully so, have been all about, well, how do you keep things deceptive? How do you keep your secrets, right? Once you actually start performing, again, within magic, right, a lot of people who do magic really just do it as a hobby, and that's fine, right? There's not that many people who like make a living performing, like actually performing magic for actual people for actual money, right? Where like that's literally what their income is. That it's a much smaller group. And when you get to that point where like that's what you're doing, right? Like you are hired by either a, often a wealthy client or a big company to do a thing, and you need to perform then and there that day, and you needs to be awesome every time. So, there are a lot of logistical things that you just learn about. Okay, I'm performing at a banquet where the tables are circular. If I don't have people turn their chairs around, 50% of the room can't see me. Bad, right? This is a much bigger room than I was told it would be. I need a mic. I need to, better have a sound system with me or have access to one, right? Or this, like, just looking at the audience. Oh, that person looks great to participate. Oh, nope, they went through 4 glasses of wine in the last 25 minutes. They're not coming up on stage. These are just logistical things, right? Where you want it to be a nice, seamless, smooth performance, and also for the sake of the audience member, right? You don't want to put someone under too much pressure And they, I can imagine if I was watching a performance in another country with people who spoke a different language and I didn't speak any of it or very little of it, I might feel really nervous coming up on stage if I was being asked to do language demanding tasks. If it's not a language demanding task, it doesn't matter as much. But like, these are just all logistical issues that you will, and the way you learn to deal with these is you slam face first into every one of them and fall apart completely. And then you figure out how to make that not happen again. And then you talk to other performers as well, and they can kind of remedy some of these for you and provide some good kind of steps to take to not run to those. But it's really like, it's the logistical stuff that gets you when you are actually out in like the real world performing for people. Like if you can get people to see you do the magic you're doing for them, you've good success. That's a big part of it. So yeah.
See in the broader sense.
Like literally physically with their eyes, could they point them at you and appreciate that a magic trick happened, right? Like that can be surprisingly difficult in certain contexts. And so, yeah, making that happen, there's a whole lot of logistical stuff that you just don't know until you run into it.
So last question. What's the biggest ethical concern around magic that you think about?
Well, I think I'm going to give you two of them. One of them we've sort of already discussed. Or 10. No.
9.
9. 9's, yes, 9. Or 8. 8 or 9, yes.
Or 9?
Yeah. I can give you 9, but numbers 2 through 9 will all be the same. Well, one we already touched on, which is like, what beliefs is the audience going to leave with? And are they leaving with anything that could really actually be detrimental to them, right? Kind of be honest with yourself. Is that really the case or not in this context? And it might be and it might not be. And, it's funny, earlier I was talking about magicians who I know have very different perspectives. There's actually a group chat I'm in with 2 other magicians, and one of them is way on one end of a spectrum, the other one's way on the other end. I'm kind of smack in the middle between them, and I don't mean to say that I'm right because I'm in the middle, but it's just very interesting, the kind of discussions and arguments that we have in a positive way about these things, because we very much respect each other's opinions, we just have very different opinions. So it's a lot of back and forth, which is very helpful. They kind of serve as, we've all heard the term like a yes man. They are very much they're like a no man, which is really important to have, because like, this is not, I think maybe Daniel Kahneman said this or someone in that vein, but you get the best feedback from someone who really cares about you, but doesn't care about your feelings. And those are those people for me where like, someone will be like, oh, that was cool or whatever. And, people will like kiss up to you for whatever reason. And they'll just be like, Daniel, that sucked. And here's why. And they'll, and you need people to do that for you in any kind of performing context so that you don't, you don't become divorced from reality. So that's one ethical concern after that slight diversion of what's the audience going to believe. The other ethical concern with magic is...
Before that, are there places where the person on the side of the spectrum of caution thought that you were going too far?
Yeah, actually. And then there are well, if you're a total purist and that you will never ever lie to your audience about anything, then basically any kind of sleight of hand that I do where I'm going to have to tell you some lies, right? They're not into. But if I'm of like, well, look, I'm willing to tell benevolent, benign lies in a performance, but I don't want to convince people that I'm able to do things that would be like harmful beliefs for them to hold. Other people do that, and I would, criticize that. And if they're my friends, I criticize it loudly and openly to their face, and we have a lively debate about it, and we both, learn from that.
But to some people on the more cautious side, even the sort of deception that you create can be too much.
I'm sure. There's people occupy every part of that spectrum.
Interesting.
Absolutely. Yep.
So the second.
What's that? The second is more within magic, which is the idea of sort of honoring your mentors and crediting people, right? Which is real important. So we talked about magic being a guild, and I said it's less of a guild, but there still is an honor code. The honor code is not, you always hear, the honor code, never do the same trick twice, never reveal a secret, and those are just kind of party lines. Those aren't real things that people care about. But what does really matter is being honest about your sources and your inspirations and giving credit where credit is due. And if you miscredit someone, write them an email and apologize and, fix it, right? And to not take credit for things that you yourself haven't like come up with, right? And to be fair about where stuff came from. That's a huge thing in the magic community. Because unlike, like in stand-up comedy, right, as I understand it, basically you have to write all your own jokes, right? You are not meant to use jokes from other people.
Unless you're Robin Williams.
Magic, however, is very different in that there are many magicians who have a perfectly good career performing only magic that they read in books. Magic, and that's not an insult to them at all. That's fine. That's something that, like, everyone performs tricks that are not their own because these were published in a magic book for other people to do and perform, right? But, like, if you look in the description of any of my YouTube videos, you'll find at least one, sometimes multi-paragraph block of text where I'm like, now, this section of the video is inspired by this idea from this person, which was published in this book in this year. And this next thing was published by this person in this book in this year. And I don't have an exact source, but people I trust who know more about magic history than I do say that this person invented
You basically
this
establish an entire magical bibliography to your videos.
Yes, to the best of my ability.
But you also incorporated that into your act to an extent. A lot of your the narrative arc of your shows, at least the one that I was able to watch on YouTube, rely on a combination of intellectual history and some historiographical approach to magic. What about magicians that don't do that? That's not their style.
Their entire presentation is to transport you to a different dimension of experience, something that's not grounded stylistically in history.
That's fine.
Where do they put their citations?
So it's less about, it's not that you need, it's like if I do a show for the public, right? Magicians don't require that I cite stuff. What it comes down to is if you're just doing a show for the public, right? It's not, you don't need to give them a bibliography. It's that if you are gonna like make a video or something that's gonna live on the internet, you, in my opinion, not everyone agrees with this. There are lots of arguments I've heard one way or the other. I think that you should cite your sources and be fair about your citations. And importantly, right, it's not just that you have to cite your sources, is that you don't, if a trick was invented by 10 different people, you're not going to go say, well, this was all invented by person number 2. It's like, well, that there is a very complex history to these ideas, and you have to be nuanced about it, right? Like there have been times in my YouTube videos where like I missed a citation by 1 year. Like I thought person A invented something because they published in 1999, but actually it was published in 1998 first by another guy. And I mixed it up and I got an email from that other guy who was like, hey, you're not crediting my work. And I looked up some magic bibliography. I was like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I misremembered the year of publication. My bad. And he was like, totally fine. We worked it out. So it's a situation, right, where like there wasn't any malicious intent on my part. I just couldn't remember which one was published in 1998 versus 1999, and that's my bad. I should have double checked. But that's very different from like people who are like intentionally trying to like not credit other people or just they don't know the literature themselves. So there is there are lots of perspectives on this, not just mine, and also there's a whole kind of honor code within magic about being, citing your sources, about showing respect for your mentors and all of that, and being clear about where stuff came from. So that's why if you look at any of my videos, you're going to find on YouTube, you'll find at least one, usually many paragraphs. If I have limited space, I'll at least put the names of the people when I don't have space to do a whole citation block on certain other platforms.
Like this is another tradition that would easily being eroded by YouTube.
Yeah, it's absolutely being eroded by
my
YouTube,
source is this guy in his underwear who was teaching me.
Exactly. And even if you did learn it there, if you're going to do this seriously, and if you wish to be taken seriously by other people in the magic community, it behooves you to find out where this actually came from.
To do your research.
It's actually a website by this magician named Dennis Bear. It's called Conjuring Archive. It is the biggest online magic bibliography. It's hugely helpful, incredible database that this guy and a team put together. But yeah, like a centralized bibliography for all things magic. It's great.
And if people want to check out your YouTube video?
Yes. So if you Google Daniel Roy Magic, you'll find me on YouTube and Instagram and TikTok and any other platform that ever exists. I will be at Daniel Roy Magic.
You're getting in touch with your Gen Z roots on TikTok.
So how are you liking TikTok?
I don't know. I've only done it for a week, so I really don't know.
Let us know how that adventure pans out.
It's been interesting.
You're also available for gigs.
Yes.
and events.
So briefly, since I guess we're in self-promotion phase, so
I brought you to it.
This is great.
My doing.
So currently, I run an online course on Patreon. So if you want to learn magic and sleight of hand, I do teach private lessons, but most these days people sign up for my online course. It's called Card Magic 101. So if you just go to cardmagic101.com, you'll find it. So corporate entertainment, private parties, those are kind of my main venues. So I'm also hopefully will someday in New York have my own like running parlor show at a fancy hotel or upscale space or whatever, a recurring, weekly or monthly show. It's kind of more of a theatery thing, but that's another thing I'm hopefully going to get to do someday.
All right. Well, if the pandemic allows, one day soon in the future in New York City, we'll all be at a Daniel Roy venue. And in the meantime, check out the YouTube.
Yep, and website and a lot of stuff is
those-
virtual these days. So I do, Zoom shows and all that
Let's
jazz.
talk about your parents.
Next time.
Yes, next time on episode 2. Yes.
Thank you, Daniel.
Of course. Thanks very much.
Thank you for listening to Uncertain Things. Follow us on uncertain.substack.com or wherever you get your podcasts. We are Uncertain Pod on the social media, and if you're feeling generous, please give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts because that helps a lot. Share us with your friends and enemies, and until next time, stay sane.
Cool.
Is there a term for the space where you do the magic?
The table in front of me next to the microphone.
Doesn't have jargon?
No, not for this. Yeah, the
Okay.
working surface. Yeah.
The workings are.
Field of deception.
Yes, exactly. So this is going to be a bit of an experiment because, of course, a lot of this is just going to be for your audio listeners. So
Right.
I'm going to be performing some magic, and I've selected things that I'm hoping maybe will play over this. So what this means.
in case not, we do have the video rolling. So
Oh,
for
okay,
audio
perfect.
listeners
Yes.
who
Yes,
are
wanna see it.
unsatisfied with
Fine,
the
yes.
audio version of this trip,
Right.
would you like me to help with narrating or anything like that?
That's you read my mind.
Okay.
First trick done. No. Yes. Yeah, I knew it. No.
Also, I'm wondering if and tell
Yeah.
us if it's going to disrupt your work.
Sure.
If we just have also an iPhone camera.
If it was here, it would get in the way just because then
So, no,
you're gonna need your
I
hands
don't
free.
get any more
Yeah.
trouble.
Nah, this is fine. Okay. So yeah, of course, for listeners, if I say now I'm putting a card on the table, they're not gonna believe me.
Okay.
But if you narrate it, either I've paid you a
Trusted
lot of
host.
money,
Yeah.
or your. So I will have you narrate some things.
I solemnly swear I've been given no money to say whatever I'm about to
Right.
say.
Yeah.
But for tax purposes, we need to admit that Daniel Roy is the new sponsor of the podcast.
Yes. And this podcast is Daniel Roy Magic, making tricks work on air since now. No. Let's see if it works. Okay. It's funny. A lot of our discussion so far has revolved around cognitive biases, blind spots, how to see things clearly or not. And there are 2 books I actually brought with me that I can give to you. You may have read these, and if you have, that's fine. One's called The Elephant in the Brain, and the other's called The Scout Mindset. Have you guys read either of these?
No.
The elephant in the brain. Yes.
Yes. 2 of my favorite books of the year, presenting what I'd say are actually pretty different takes on the same topic, some of which you might buy their arguments, you might not, but I think they're interesting reads. So would you take either book?
Okay, I'll take the
Oh,
elephant.
just one of you. You're
I'll
gonna
take the
it.
elephant in the
All right,
brain.
Just put it under the couch.
Under the couch. It's
We'll leave
going.
it. We'll come back to it.
Vanessa is putting the elephant in the brain.
under the couch.
Wait, so
Yeah.
our couch is a little annoying, but
It's completely irrelevant. I just wanted to get rid of one of the books up front
Okay.
because we're only going to need one of them.
Got it.
Okay, and then with cards.
but is it irrelevant? No, just kidding. Keep
Yeah,
going.
no, it is actually. That book actually is irrelevant. What? So we'll use the Scout Mindset by Julia Gallup. We'll use that in a minute. Okay, and then with cards, we are going to need both decks of cards. We can't throw one of them away, but I will give you whichever deck you take. You're going to put it in your pocket, and we will use it later.
Okay,
So you
Adam
know
is taking the
explicitly what's
blue
gonna happen.
deck and he's
Okay.
putting it in his pocket.
Perfect. Okay, so we've got 2 decks.
It's a
of
full
cards.
deck. It has plastic on it still.
I just
Sorry.
yes, the seal is broken, but otherwise it
Hear
was
that
just
good
a,
plasticky crunch, people.
yeah, good ASMR content. Yes. Oh yeah, love it. Okay.
Okay, so
So-
Daniel has the red deck.
Yeah, so I've got a red deck of cards, and Adam has a blue deck of cards in the box.
His jeans
His
pocket.
jeans pocket, his right jeans pocket, importantly.
Next to my phone.
Perfect. Now, what I'm going to ask you to do, Vanessa, is give me a number, any number you want, from 1 to 52.
9.
9. Are you absolutely sure that 9 is the number you want?
No. Can I change?
You can change your mind.
I'll go with 8.
8. That's like not a drastic change, but do you want 8 or? It's really up to you.
Oh. I guess I'll
Apply the things that we've learned, Vanessa.
I'll stick with 9.
Or you
I'll
want
stick with
9?
9.
Okay, 9 it will be. And what I'm also going to do is, Vanessa, would you just touch a card on the back?
Just touch anywhere?
Yeah, just point to one. Boop. All right. Now, it's actually okay if I see what it is in this circumstance, because it's not that kind of a trick. Okay, Jack of Hearts.
Okay.
Now,
that was me booping the Jack of Hearts.
yes, that was you booping the Jack of Hearts. And I guess show you one of the early tricks that I learned, because I was mentioning earlier about how I was at the fundraiser thing, and
When you were a kid?
Yeah, when I was a little kid. And I'm also going to. Did we go with 8 or 9?
9.
Do you want to stick with 9 or do you want to go to 8?
Okay, I'm going to stick with 9. Adam says I should stick with 9.
You're absolutely sure. Maybe Adam is in on it, and I'm just pressuring you to stick with 9.
We're going to
Up to
stick
you.
with 9.
You're going to stick with 9?
I think so.
Okay, I'm going to stick with 9. Great. I'm also going to have you choose another card for later, because we need a second one, so I'll go through, just touch one on the back. Up to you. Okay, I'm going to, this card, instead of looking at it, I will leave it here, and we're going to come back to it later. Start out with the Jack of Hearts.
Okay, so the other card is just on the table.
Yes, another card face down on the table.
away.
Come back to it later. Jack of Hearts is the important one. Now, the first trick I ever saw, and this is going to be primarily visual, so you'll be able to appreciate it. People on the podcast listening, well, tough luck. I promise it gets better. So I'm going to take the Jack of Hearts, and I'm going to put it relatively close to the middle of the deck.
Okay.
So importantly, you can see it's not on the bottom or on the top.
Right.
Fair enough.
I don't know where it is, but it's somewhere in the deck.
And this was the very first trick I saw. So when you say go, I'm going to try to make that card jump to the top. So tell me when to go.
To the to the top of the
the
deck.
deck. Yes. Tell me when to
Okay.
go.
Go.
Done. The Jack of Hearts is now on the top.
Now, the Jack of Hearts is indeed at the top of the deck.
Instead of just putting it...
Daniel kept the deck upside down, then revealed.
Yes,
that it's
exactly.
It didn't jump actually, but
Yes,
it
but
then,
invisibly, yeah.
Yes.
I'm going to put the card this time actually exactly 9th from the top. Exactly 9th from the top.
Okay.
So tell me when to
How
go.
did you know it was 9th from the top?
I'll
count?
explain that. in a
Okay.
minute. Yeah. Tell me when to go.
Okay. So now what? I'm saying
Yeah,
go
say,
again?
Say go in.
Okay. Go.
Done. Okay, so you've established we
Jack
can do
of
that.
Hearts.
Yeah. Now,
Yes.
but you expressed some skepticism there, which I respect. Because I claimed that I put a certain card exactly 9th from the top, right? You were like, oh, how'd you know it was 9th? Maybe it wasn't 9th. So what if I go the other way? We'll use the other card. It's okay if we look
the
at it.
secret card.
King of Spades this time. King of Spades. Just so you know, there's not something special about one of these cards. So King of Spades. This time, how about this? I'll put the King of Spades on top, and I will make it jump to the 9th position. So it'll go from the top to the 9th position from the top.
It's definitely on the top. I just saw it. He
Yeah,
just
definitely
flashed it.
here.
Okay.
You say go, it will be 9th from the top. Tell me to go.
Okay. Go.
Done.
Okay.
King of Spades is now 9th from the top. Not in this deck of cards.
No, in Adam's pocket?
There's been a deck of cards this entire time inside Adam's pocket, which has been in the case. So Adam, what I want you to do is take the cards out. I'll get your wine out of the way. And I want you to take them out and hold them face down like you're going to deal. Hold them face down like you're going to deal.
Adam is pulling out the cards face down.
And you're now going to deal face down onto the table 8 cards. So very slowly you'll count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, which means this is 9. Is
Yes,
that right?
that's the one.
So you could have said any card, or any number, I should say, and you
Yes.
said 9. We went back and forth from 8 to 9 to 9 to 8.
Yes.
And you could have said any card. What was the card? It was the King of
Spades.
King of Spades. Would you take a look at the 9th card?
Oh, it is indeed the King of Spades. Yay.
Okay.
Clap, clap,
Glad
clap.
that worked. I'm very glad
I
that
would
worked.
clap, but I'm snapping because I have a microphone in my hand.
That is wild.
That was crazy.
Yeah.
Good. All right. I'm glad that that worked. I never know with these whether they'll actually work out. Yeah, so that's kind of an example of just something where, we were talking about the creative process earlier and the idea of, how do you impose constraints. So this is like, okay, well, it's got to be something that can be done where people are able to participate, and also something where, it'll, even if you can only listen, as long as you guys can confirm that actually, oh no, it really was ninth from the top, and I'm not just, making things up as I go along, that, this really did occur in some way. So that's been kind of a fun thing to think about.
So when you ask me to say go, it's really irrelevant when I say go. Like there's actually no, like you've already done the trick like immediately.
Yeah, it's sort of, it serves two purposes. One, it emphasizes that I'm not actually manipulating the cards, or at least it doesn't look like I'm actually manipulating the cards. But two, the other thing it does is it provides a little kind of comedic, moment, and also just some sort of
tension building.
Moment. Yeah. I should mention that I'm going to give you both these decks of cards as souvenirs at the end of the podcast.
Are these the ones that people can get on your, or one day get on your show?
One
your
day
merch?
you'll be able to buy cards on my website. These cards you can buy at any store. So Walgreens, Costco, just a deck of cards. Okay. I'd like to give one more of these a shot. We're gonna see if this works or not. This will be more experimental than the last one.
Ooh, okay.
Interesting. So can you hand Adam the mic?
I can
I'm
indeed.
gonna have you primarily help out with this one because you did the dealing in the last one. So Vanessa, I'm going to give these cards a shuffle. And these were the cards that, importantly, that you handled a moment ago. I mean, you can see they're not all like the Queen of Spades or anything like that. Fair enough. And in fact, I'm going to give you the chance to mix these in just a moment yourself. But in the meantime, I'm going to drop through the cards. Well, if I do it face up, you can see is the problem, so I'll do it face down. And I want you to call stop about halfway down so we can split the deck approximately in half, okay? So you call stop about halfway.
Stop.
All right, are you happy there? Do you want to go another card or two?
Yes, a little bit more. Okay, stop.
Happy there?
Yes.
Okay. And I'm going to give you these cards. So it's very important. Hold these like you're going to deal. What's very important before we go on is that you chose exactly which cards you ended up with. If you'd called stop at a different point, we'd each have different cards. I'm going to need to teach you a few different card handling things. Now, whether or not you've played cards before, I'm going to show you how magicians handle cards. So I'll explain a couple things. Don't worry. I'll walk you through it very slowly. The first thing is simply how to deal cards. So hold them like you're going to deal. And I want you to deal one card and just put it on the table like this. Good. And then you're going to deal the next card on top of it like this. And you're going to keep dealing like this into a pile. Very good. Now, you don't have to deal off the top. You could also deal off the bottom if you want to. Take a card from the bottom or even from the middle. You can deal from wherever you want.
I don't know how to do that.
Yeah. There you go. Very good. And in fact, pause there and just give the remaining cards a shuffle. Shuffle them like this. Mix them up as much as you like. And then you can continue dealing. You can deal off the top or off the bottom. You could deal 2 at a time or 3 at a time. And whenever you want. No, that's fine. That's fine. Totally fine. No, a trick doesn't work. No, it's fine. And whenever you want, you can stop and shuffle again. And we're just going to keep doing this until you've made one big messy pile on the table.
Very messy. I'm going from
Yep.
the bottom. I'm going from the top. I'm going from the middle awkwardly. I'm doing
Perfect.
Okay.
Exactly. Yep. Very good. Ooh, very nice. Slick bottom deal at the end. And from the middle. And how are you going to do the last two? Great. Okay, perfect. And square all the cards up like this. All right, good. And then now we are going to trade piles for this next part. So I'm going to give you my pile, and you're going to take mine. And the next thing is, do you know how to see how magicians fan cards out? So you're going to spread the cards out like this. And what you're going to...
Such a much nicer fan than my fan.
Almost like he does it for a living.
You've been doing this a little while, right? Here's what you're going to do in a moment. You're going to just take a few cards out of the middle.
Of mine.
Yeah, just out of the middle, and you're just going to put them on top of your pile like this. Perfect. And the reason, of course, you do this is it changes the order of all the cards. It changes which cards are on top, right?
Yes.
We're going to do this a second time, but we're going to trade. So first of all, you're going to spread these out, and I'm going to choose a few from the middle of your pile. I guess I'll take maybe a small group from here, and I'll put them on top of mine. Now square yours up. I'll do the same. I'll spread mine out. Just take a few out of the middle. Yeah, 3, 4, 5, up to you. That looks good. And put them on top of yours.
Took more than 5.
That's fine. Doesn't matter. And now we're going to trade again.
Okay.
Reason we do this, right, is at this point, right, you have now mixed, of course, you decided how we split the cards, but you've now also mixed all the cards in both piles and changed the order of them. Now,
To a
what we're
ridiculous extent.
Right. And now what we're going to do is we're going to make 4 piles. So just take a few cards, not all of them, just maybe 3 or 4 cards, and kind of put them in a pile, let's say, right there. Right? And then you're going to take a few more, just a few. So you're going to still have some cards left over at the end. And then you're going to take a few more and put them here. And then a few more and put them here, and I will do the same thing. Let me just slide this ever so slightly so I've got space. Okay, we're good. We're good. Yes, we're good. All right, make a pile here and make a pile here. So in other words, from the cards that you shuffled, we've both just made 4 piles. But we do still have some cards left in our hands like this. So what you're now going to do is we're going to start dealing. So start on either end, this one or that one.
Wait, sorry. What do you want me to do? You want me to deal them where?
Yep, so you're going to deal 1 card there.
Okay, so I have 4 piles on the table. Daniel has 4 piles on the table. I'm going to start
But dealing from your hand.
dealing
here.
from my hand into the piles.
Yep, and then you're going to
Like
deal
so.
1 to the next pile,
Got it.
1 to the next, and then you're just going to cycle
Got it.
exactly like this. Yep. This
Off they go.
exactly.
Getting
just-
pandemic legacy flashbacks.
Good.
PTSD.
Okay, so to recap, right? A deck of cards that you have hopelessly shuffled both piles. You decided how we split the cards. You decided exactly how we made these piles, right? You shuffled, you cut. as
They're
much as you
uneven. There's no consistency.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's no way anyone could have known in advance which cards you'd end up with, how they'd be mixed, or even what cards would end up on the tops of your piles. So let's see how you did. Let's turn over this card, see how it was. Oh, a king. That's a good card.
King of Hearts.
All right, why don't you turn over the next one, see how he did. Did we get any
Pile number 2.
get any match?
King of Clubs.
Oh, this is good. This is good. And what about the next one? What about the next one?
Pile number 3 is a King of Spades. All right, and pile number 4 is a King of Diamonds. What? Wait.
Very
What,
good.
I want to
Now,
see your pile.
the question is, right, if you've
You're
got the
becoming
4
your sister.
kings,
Yeah,
if
yeah.
you've got the 4 kings, hopefully I should have done a little better. I've gotten an
Whoa.
ace and and a 3 of diamonds and a 6 of hearts and a 2 of diamonds. All right, well, that's
Well,
what I
you're-
get for trying something new on a podcast.
But my pile worked.
but
Mine
your
was
pile
very,
worked.
very
Yay!
impressive.
This is good.
We could just cut the trick there.
Yeah.
We don't have to do it.
Yeah, we don't. But it's actually, first of all, it's kind of awesome because we were talking about the
Right.
experimentation, and second,
Yeah.
I mean, because I'm clueless about magic, it's actually more mind blowing that you controlled Vanessa's
Yeah.
deck than
Right.
yours.
Yeah.
Do you want to try a redo?
Oh wait, you know what? Let me
Do you
so
wanna-
this is actually something we talked about earlier, where I was saying that when stuff goes wrong, right? There are times where it goes wrong, and where I know what went wrong before you did. This was not one of those options. This is where we found out about it at the same time. But what I didn't mention is you can try to salvage it. Like I at least got 1 ace, or I could say, oh look, it's ace 2 3. That's pretty good, right? I'm gonna try to salvage this, and I'm gonna kind of be just improvising here. We'll see if I can get anything worthwhile to happen. So it is important to say that even though these were the cards that I ended up with, these were cards that you also shuffled at the very beginning, right? You went through these, we traded cards, right, when we had the piles. Fair enough? So you had some control over the order of these cards. Great. So even if I was, pulling all the strings, I couldn't have exerted any real control here. Instead of looking at this like, I guess instead of looking at like a 4, like just, kings, we could look at this like a number, like different digits. So I guess, right, a 3 would be a 3. And ace is a 1, right, generally. And then a 6 is 6, and then a 2 is 2. And you might remember that not only did I give you a choice over cards, you chose which deck of cards to put away for us to not use.
Right.
You also chose which book for us to put away to not use, leaving us with the Scout Mindset. Would you take this from me? Yes. All right. Let me think about this for a moment. All right. Let's try this. Let's say so 3162. That's the number we've got here, right? Those are the 4 cards I ended up with. 3 of diamonds, ace of clubs, 6 of hearts, 2 of diamonds. Fair enough?
Uh-huh.
If we interpret this, where can I go with this? Oh, okay. How about this? So 3-1, like, let's pretend this is number 31.
Okay.
That's a page number. Can you go to page 31 in the book?
Sure.
See what we end up with.
Get some of this more ASMR.
Yes. Some good book page turning.
We are now turning the pages of the Scout Mindset.
Great book, by the way. Highly recommend. To page 31. And of course, if you have this book at home, you can follow along in this is a hardcover copy. So page 31, is that where we're at?
And it reads, are we rationally irrational?
Yes.
Is what it says on this page.
And then I guess, so we've got 31, but then we've got 2 other numbers. We've got a 6. So I guess let's interpret this as being the line number. So can you count down to the 6th line of the page? Sorry, from the very top, I mean.
From the very top.
Yeah, from the
Sorry,
top of
I
the
got
page.
distracted by
yes.
the are we rationally
Attention.
irrational?
Yes. Yeah, no, the 6th line of the page.
This is some people see things clearly and others don't.
Yeah.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's
Okay.
the last line of the
That
first
paragraph. And then the number is 2. So can you count in, what's the second word of that line?
brain.
Oh, that's a good word. Kind of something to do with the pie. Ta-da! Yay! I'm kidding. I just kind of wanted to see what we'd end up with. But to be clear, right, from cards you shuffled, we ended up with 3162, and you went to page 31, and you went to the 6th line, and you went to the 2nd word. So there's really no way we could have known exactly what word we would land on here. Correct. Fair enough?
That's true.
However, before we started filming, I asked for 2 implements from you guys.
Yes.
Remember what those were?
Paper, and you had the pencil, and I gave you the
wrote
paper.
something down with a pen on paper, yes.
Yes, and I also gave you a coaster to put the paper under.
Have I gone near the coaster?
No, you have not. Not since you started. Not since you put the paper under it.
So the word we ended up with was brain, which could have been any word in either book, right? You could have picked a different book. You also could have ended up at different cards. So, for example, if we'd been one card before, it would have been a 4 instead of a 3, or it could have been, for example, an 8 instead of a 1. So we could have ended up at any page, at any line, at any word in either book, but we ended up at brain.
Right. No. No. Okay.
Vanessa lifts the coaster. Vanessa carefully unfolds the paper. Vanessa reveals the folded paper. Show the word.
No, it says brain.
Don't show it to me. Show it to the camera.
Oh, it says brain. What?
Indeed it does.
So did you mess up the trick, or are you messing with us? Oh man, it's all in the brain. Well done.
It's amazing. I've watched a bunch of I'd say, I don't know if hours. It's probably hours of Daniel's magic on YouTube. I know that the false mistake is part of his act. But even like I was not sure. Is it real? So I will leave it at that. Maybe it wasn't. This was a fallback. Maybe it was the plan. Either way, this is.
Was this plan A or B or
Exactly.
C or F? Who knows?
May I inspect the rest of the paper?
Of course you may. Do make sure that there are no other words. I didn't go through the entire lexicon of both books and write every word.
You just put the book under the.
Correct. No, there was just one piece of paper and only one word.
Now, if I open the other book and I go to page 31, line 6, word 2, it won't be brain.
Different word.
Interesting.
At least at the minimum means that he had 2 different ways of controlling his hand,
right.
which is fucking bananas.